Alrighty, here we go, everyone. Welcome. My name is Tree. I'll be your host today. We're going to be talking a little bit about scripting and how you can write scripts in DayZ, as well as how do you read vanilla scripts? How do you take an idea that you have, or maybe an idea that somebody else has, and then put it into the game, right? That's kind of ultimately why we have scripting. You know, you normally have modeling, which is building the model. 3D meshes, we all kind of understand that. Then there's the texturing side of things, which is just the painting of that model. Those two kind of stick together a little bit, but people kind of specialize into those. And you can do a lot with just models and even just porting models from places like Sketchfab. Um, this is where I got the Infinity Gauntlet that you might have seen earlier. Being able to just take somebody else's work and port it is really useful for a scripter, because I don't know how to do the modeling or texturing, but I do know how this stuff relates to behaviors in the game. So as we go through this, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. I can promote you so you can ask it and we can talk about it. This doesn't have to be just me talking at you all for an hour or so. Yeah, that being said, we'll go ahead and jump into it. I'm kind of assuming people have a little bit of baseline knowledge, and let's go ahead and get this into something we can actually read. So for starters, a lot of what scripting has to offer is in the game already. And what I mean by that is a lot of what I do on my day-to-day basis is read what is already present in vanilla. And in order to do that, you kind of have to have some tools set up. And so what I personally use is VS Code. Some people are known to use Atom or Sublime or Notepad++. Some people wear that as a badge. And really all you need is something that can open a folder in like a browser. And so like VS Code lets me open the DayZ projects folder. And as you can see here, I have DayZ. And if I scroll down here, I have scripts, which is these are the vanilla files. So just for posterity, in order to do that, right, we'll go to Visual Studio Code, or in your case, you could have Notepad++. I'll try and do that after this. You download the link. And the most important part of this process, which is usually skipped. Okay, it wants me to close first. All right, we're closed. We'll accept the agreement. It doesn't matter if you run it multiple times, because really, in my opinion, the important part here is add open with code action to the Windows Explorer file context menu and the directory context menu. This makes it so I can go to any folder in the game. And so I have my, let's go to DayZ projects, documents, DayZ projects, right? So this is where the files are located. I can just right click DayZ projects and open with code. And then it pops up everything in here. And so in my opinion, this is like step 0 of learning how to script. Being able to do this is invaluable in your scripting journey. And let's see if we can do it in Notepad. Let's see, file, open folder as workspace. Let's go documents, boom. Okay, cool. So here's how you would do it in Notepad. And some people actually do this in Notepad. So like, probably taking forever to load up. Anyway, the whole reason why we want to open this in DayZ projects is so that I can search all files. So there's this little icon over here. Control Shift F is the hotkey to bring up search all files. Control Shift F. And again, what I do in my day-to-day is read vanilla. And so if I wanted to see what an apple does, I would just type in class apple. Actually, really, before I even knew what classes are, I could just type in apple, and this shows me everywhere in the DayZ files where apple exists. And that's a lot of things to just parse through. And so I know as a scripter and some of my experience that objects are defined with the class keyword. And so I can kind of narrow the search a little bit by putting class in front of there. And so now I can kind of see a little bit more concisely where apple is used elsewhere in the files. So for starters, you see the apple defined in the config. This is like base data. Think of it like an encyclopedia. You write it down, you print it out, and once you've printed it out, you can't really change it. It's a book. It's text. These are static values. They don't really change. And so this is what is loaded first for scripts. And then this data that you see here, like temperature and freeze time and the slots that it can attach to and the textures that are run at render and the materials that are applied to it and the damage system and blah, 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 all this stuff. All this stuff is loaded into the script side, which is when I click this little button here or this little option, it takes us to the class definition on the script side. And if I go back over to my left-hand side to Explorer, again, this is kind of like my File Explorer, just like this thing here. Basically the same thing, right? Like you can kind of see how they mimic each other. And so I see that the apple has a bunch of text in here, right? If I don't know anything about scripting, I come in here and I go, wow, look at all the things that are here. I don't know what it does. So this kind of jumps into our first topic, which is object-oriented programming. We have some conceptual pillars that scripting is built upon, and understanding those pillars, even at its basics, will really help you understand how this all is set up and how to actually like interpret what we're seeing. And so if we can think about the categories of things within scripting or within coding, we have something called polymorphism. We have something called inheritance, if I can spell. We have something called encapsulation. And we have something called abstraction. Okay. And so you've used all of these already if you've done like retextures, or if you've already done like mod overriding. You've done these already, and so you just need to like put a name to it. And so we'll put names to it at the moment so that you kind of understand what's going on. So inheritance, we'll start with inheritance because that's kind of the easiest one. Inheritance is very much like retexturing. All right, so if we're gonna do like a mini retexture, let's say I want to retexture a shirt. All right, class t-shirt. Let's look in the base files for all the shirts. Wow, look at that. There are so many, right? So we'll click one at random, like, oh, this beige one. And actually, let's take a step back for a second and notice that there is this weird version called a color base. And then you have like these other smaller versions of the shirt, and they only describe one thing about themselves, like the texture that they are. And so this right here is an example of inheritance where we have a base class, or parent in this case, sometimes we like to call them, but base class that defines the encyclopedia or the dictionary or the definitions of a thing. And in this case, that thing is a t-shirt. And so we use a single container, again, a class, parent class, to define all of this so we don't have to keep writing it down. You'll notice that if I collapse the t-shirt color base, you'll notice that all of the children classes that inherit the parent class from color base, they're only writing out three things actually. Scope, which makes the item exposed so that you can spawn it in. This visibility modifier, which is for AI, and then hidden selections textures, which is the actual texture to apply to the object. And so already, if you've done retexturing, you have engaged in what we would call in the scripting world inheritance. And this is powerful because you can chain this inheritance as far as you want. And actually, as we get into this, you'll see that an item base is actually really just an entity AI, which is really just an object. And so an edible base is really just an item base, which is an entity AI, which is really just an object. And so when you think about the game as a whole, it really just is passing around these really generic things that it calls objects. And then when we really need the information, we kind of cast them to be specific. And so that's a little bit about inheritance. All right. There's this notion of encapsulation. I'll go with the next one there because it's a little bit easier to explain. And encapsulation is, in my opinion, one of the pitfalls of a new developer, and they will not encapsulate things correctly. And the easiest way to think of encapsulation is we keep things together that need to be together. And an analogy is when you go to the store and you pay for something, you don't take off your pants and hand your pants to the cashier so that the cashier can take the wallet out of the pants and then take the money out, right? You have a pay function, which you would have pull out either cash or you would pull out your credit card and you would hand it to the barista or to the cashier in this case. And so very often you'll see people, new scripters, when they are making scripts, they will put code in the init.c. And in my opinion, this is a big faux pas because you're not encapsulating the behavior correctly. You're kind of throwing it out into the wild for anything to happen. And it can cause problems later down the line as it doesn't allow you to extend your code, and it causes things to be less flexible, which in the end, we're trying to build stuff that A, I don't have to maintain in the future, and B, I can extend if somebody asks for it. So anything that makes code easier to read 6 months to a year from now is good. Anything that makes it harder is bad, in my opinion. So that's kind of like a religious hill the scripters can die on. So that's kind of my hot take. And I'm going to put that there. Okay, polymorphism. Polymorphism is one of the things in the game that allows us to make a generic method or function in a parent class. Like, let's see if we can find one. Oh yeah, here we go. On consume. Actually, no. We'll do abstraction for this one. All right. Okay, so abstraction is just a fancy word for grouping behavior to be more generic. And so when you think of consuming medical items in DayZ, right? You have charcoal tablets, which kind of does one thing, and you have chelating target tablets, which are a new thing for heavy metal. You have painkillers, which kind of does another thing, and then you have tetracycline and then vitamin bottles. They all kind of do this different things, but they all call the onConsume function, right? And we do that, again, we do that to, what's the right word? To capitalize on inheritance by allowing our parent class to define a method that our children classes can implement. And so this is kind of a difficult thing to wrangle your head around, but in this case, let me show how this works. All right, so we have edible base, which inherits from item base. So if you remember earlier, we said that items that inherit from parent classes get all of the things from the parent. And so we're going to go down, instead of going up to our grandparents, we're going to go down to our grandchildren. And so edible base is inherited by a couple things, like charcoal tablets. So if you notice, class charcoal tablets extends edible base. So that means that charcoal tablets, while it has this set actions function and the onConsume function, it also has all of these other things in here inside of the edible base. And so you get that for free. I inherit it from my parents. Okay. And so in this case, my parent has a function called onConsume. And what this does is now that if my parent has the function onConsume, I also have the function onConsume. And that means since I have that function, I can change it however I want with the override keyword. All right, and this is where the magic happens in DayZ. Okay, you can even see in vanilla them utilizing their own override keyword here, all throughout their code. And the only difference with modding is that we have what we call the modded keyword for classes. And so we'll get to that later. But so that entire explanation centers around the notion that we have abstracted the consumption, this onConsume function, out into a parent class, because we want to be able to use the consume function on a list of edibles. So if we were in the game and we had to keep track of every charcoal tablet individually, that would be kind of cumbersome. Or every tetracycline packet, like a list for specifically just those items. One of the nice things about abstraction and inheritance is that if I have a shape of data, like if I have something that is like class A, and it has int I. Okay, and I have class B, and it inherits from class A, and it has a string S. Okay. If I make a list of, I make a new class B, sorry, new B, okay. Let's do BB1, okay. And I make a bunch of these, right? B2, B3, B4. And I add them all to a list. I can do this in one of two ways. Okay. B technically is a parent of A. So I could have an array. Just say, we'll use some shorthand here. I can do array A equals new. Okay, and then I can say array1.insert B1. Right, and I could do that to all of these. I'm just gonna do some shorthand there, all right? Or I can do this. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, well, why would you want to do either one of those? And the answer is it really depends on your use case. And so when I use class A and class B, it's kind of generic and doesn't really make sense. But what if class A is entity AI and class B is item base? Well, now you're kind of talking about, well, it makes sense for the game to keep track of entity AIs over item base, mainly just because entity AI is a smaller memory footprint. It contains fewer variables if we were to look at the actual classes, and it's more generic so that the game doesn't need to know about things that it doesn't need to know about. The engine has been built with encapsulation in mind. And so this is one reason why I'm broaching these subjects with you, because when we talk about 3 game, 4 world, and 5 mission, okay, we have encapsulated behavior into each one of those areas. And there's even actually 1 core and what's the other one? Game lib. So there are even 2 other sections of the engine that have kind of been like cordoned off. And inheritance is important because 5 mission gets everything in 4 world, 4 world gets everything in 3 game, 3 game gets everything in 2 game lib, and 2 game lib gets everything in core. It doesn't go the other way around. 1 core cannot touch anything in 5 mission, mainly because when the game is actually compiled and loaded, it goes in order. So it loads core first, then game lib, then game, then world, and mission. And this is an important thing because, again, a very common pitfall for new scripters is that they'll be putting stuff in the initc, or they'll add a config and try to have the 3 game config talk directly to 5 mission. You can't do that. 5 mission has to go up to 3 game and get the config. And so this is again, an important concept in the world of object-oriented programming. And one of the things that's important there. All right, so let's move on to something that's less theory and more like actual coding. So I have over here a couple things that I've written down that I think new scripters kind of care about. If there are any questions out in the group, feel free to raise your hand. I can work on a specific example if you'd like. But on Control-Z all that. All right, how do I accept your hand raise? Oh, there we go. Show request, invite to speak. There you go. You should be able to speak. I cannot hear you. Oh yeah, I am recording this. No manner of. If you need to type out your question, that's fine as well. Oh, there we go. Hello, you're on the air. I can kind of hear you, but yeah, you're just really low. Maybe a little louder? A little louder? There we go. Hello. It's hard to hear you. Let me bring you up some more. There we go. Yeah, so you can absolutely script retexturing. And so here, I'll give you an example of that. And actually this will touch nicely on NetSync versus RPC as well. Okay, so when we go to medical scripts, temperature scanner. Okay. So let's talk about the temperature scanner. And I'll go and okay. So the temperature scanner and NetSync versus RPC. So when we talk about how do I change a texture at runtime when the game is running, and I know the selection that I want to touch, and I know the material that or the PAA texture that I want to apply. And so right here is the smallest amount of code that I can show that does this. And so you have DayZ has a convenience function called get the hidden selection index. You can pass it a string, which is the selection itself. And this needs to be defined in the model and the model.config. And once you do that, it'll return back to you the index. And so if I go to entity AI, you can see I've searched all my files for that file name or for that function name. And in entity AI, it says returns the index of the string found in CFG array in selections. If it's not found, then it returns -1. And so I can see all in the vanilla files where it's used. And so I personally will go and grab, a version. So if you notice, I'm going to put these side by side. My code looks very similar to vanilla, right? And that's because I try to make the smallest changes that also look as close to vanilla as possible. If DayZ devs can do it, I can do it. And if they don't want me to do it, then they need to tell me not to, or like make it impossible. So like, and I've hard coded things here because this is a known thing. But let's say we want to be generic. You can look at my face paint mod where I do this by programmatically looking through a list and then applying that from a selection, like face paints. Here we go. Face paints, scripts, for world, lifespan. So in this case, I have saved everything into a map because I know where the paints are located in my file structure. I know my add-on name. And so I can programmatically build the RV mats and put them inside of a list or a map. And then based on some selection from a UI, they can then apply it based on integer index. And so you can see here, I have an integer that represents the category and then an integer that represents the actual paint in the category. So from that, you can reconstruct it if you need to. That's kind of the TLDR on how do you set an object's texture in in script side. And so if I were to want to know do it for a material, I would Control Shift F on the thing, right? It puts it up here, searches through all the files, and I'm gonna look through the results. I know DayZ Horse is not my mod. That's my mod, so I can close it. That's my mod, I can close it. Oh look, Entity AI in the base DayZ game scripts. I'm gonna click that. Oh no, proto-native. Proto-native is an engine function, all right? We can't override these, but knowing they exist is really useful because they provide a lot of stuff. Like you can see that they're doing the register netsync variables, ints, floats, switching lights. They just provide a lot of convenience functions for us to use in 4 world and 5 mission. And if you're seeing here, you can observe set object material and get object material. So technically you can get the current material on an object and you can set it to whatever you want. And so when we talk about reskin mods or like the gun spray paint mods, they're basically doing this. They have a list of textures that you can spray, and then they, set the object texture based on the ZBY text selection and then the texture name. Very, very trivial stuff. Going back to the temperature scanner though, and RPC versus netsync. This is a common question I see all the time. And kind of demystify this. Sid, do you have any follow-ups from that? Or if you do, just type them in chat. Feel free to ask questions if you have them. But we'll go on to, cool. And make sure you just click leave the stage so you can have other people join if they want. So let's move on to RPC. What is the difference between an RPC and a netsync? They do the same thing. And when I say they do the same thing, in reality, they pass data from client to server or server to client. It's basically a mechanism to transfer data from one collaborator to another. The difference is who needs to know about the change. And that's the important part, because we don't want to be telling people they need to know something when they don't need to know it, because it will cause unnecessary server performance. So that's why like the whole concept exists. RPC is something to be used when you want to tell the whole server what has happened. It can go from client to server. It can go from server to client. It's bidirectional. Netsyncs, however, are one-way, unidirectional. They can only go from server to client. And these are used to let people know in your netsync bubble the state change. And people then will say, well, what's a net bubble or what's a netsync bubble? And that's a little bit complex to answer. And so I'll kind of give you the TLDR. And what I mean by that is the devs and game developers for a long time have known that when you have a relatively large area, your players don't need to know everything about the whole map. In reality, if I'm on 0, of the map, bottom left corner, I don't really need to know about the people that are in the top left map of a 15-kilometer map. I just don't need to know about them. The server needs to know, but my client doesn't need to know. And so I can really increase my performance of my game or my runtime if I am clever about how I transfer data between client and server and between different clients. So netsync is there to really cut down that time and that shifting. And so some examples of RPC are like heli crashes. Heli goes down, you hear the sound 1 kilometer out. Your netsync bubble is 1 kilometer large for the most part, and you usually load in the other bubbles around it, just conceptually. In some cases, if you were privy to some discussions in scripting or config, somebody was mentioning, I think Genry was mentioning, most items have a netsync bubble of 155 meters, which is relatively large when you think about it. So what does that mean? Well, it means that the state of an object, like the visual state, maybe like a food item, or in this case, my screen, is only updated for people within that 150 meters. How do we do that? Okay, well, in order to actually build a netsync, it's fairly simple. The server needs to register the variable. Up here, you can see on line 7, register netsync variable int. If I want to know about how to do other variables, well, I would search that function in all files, Control-Shift-F. I would then find an entity AI where it's defined, and I'll then read Literally, I would engage my brain and I would say, okay, well, what else is out there? Register net sync variable float. We got an object, we got an int, we got another float, or sorry, these are updates. We got a bool, and that's about it. So you've got, oh, tree, where's the string? Can't net sync strings, sorry. It's an RPC. I mean, you technically could with an object, but that's different. And I'm not gonna go into that in today's session, maybe later. But anyway, I have an integer, which is the state of an object, and I register it. Easy peasy. When the object is created, register the net sync. Okay, so now the server knows that I have a variable that needs to be network synced. And the name is up here, we add it here. We need to hook into the functionality of DayZ when that variable is synchronized. So when the thing actually changes on the client, all right? So server value changes, server then says set sync dirty, we'll talk about that later. And now the client knows that the value has changed. That happens here on variable synchronized. And this gets called quite often. If you put a print inside here, you will realize that this gets called on some interval and it's unclear of when that interval is. It's just whenever the game needs the net sync, it'll do it whenever it needs to. And so it needs to be stateless, in my opinion, this notion of variable synchronizing. And what I mean by stateless is it needs to be okay to call it, 100 times. If I call it once and then that increments a variable and I call it again and increments the variable again, it's not a really good use case for a net sync variable. Just because, again, it gets called on some interval that we cannot control. Okay, so the server is registered a net sync variable. The server is set sync dirty. My client knows about the change, right? And on variable synchronized. Now I need to actually do something on the client. And so here we have update visual state. This is a function I wrote specifically. It could be called goober doober if I wanted, just to showcase that it doesn't really matter what it's named. And I have an integer. I forward declare the integer. I then check to see what the scanner state is. Since the server has net synced it to me, my client now knows the new state, and I can set the client state based on that. And so if we're in the state 1, then we grab the screen and then we turn the screen green. If we're in a state of 2, we get the screen selection and then we turn the screen red. Otherwise, we turn the screen off to neutral. And so in my case, I have 3 states: yellow or green, red, and neutral. And that is how the client changes its values. All right, and then I mentioned earlier about a set sync dirty. Well, the server needs to actually update its value. And so a nice function here is to set the state. And then when the state is changed, we call set sync dirty. This is how you tell the server, hey server, synchronize your variables. And this will cause a net sync for everything else in this color base. So lots of other things are calling set sync dirty. You can look at it and search through vanilla to see that. And this is how the server tells the client when to update. All right, and so just to recount what we talked about there, register the net sync variable so the server knows that it's actually synchronizing something. On variable synchronize is how the client knows something has changed. This is where the client logic is done. In order for the server to tell the client something is updated, it needs to call set sync dirty. And those are the 3 things you need for a net sync. Now, remember earlier when I talked about encapsulation? I did that on purpose because if you notice, I've been able to talk about the entire behavior of this thing, the temperature scanner, in a single spot. Now, as a developer in my personal life, or my professional life, I know to do this because it makes it easier to maintain. If I were to put this logic in my action, it'd be very difficult to just conceptually think about in my head. The mental overhead for that concept is too much. It's split between context. It's like walking between rooms in a house. Sometimes you just forget. And so the encapsulation here really provides a way for me to build up behavior in a way that I can use it elsewhere. And so here's the power of that. I go to my action and I scan target. Okay. 9 times out of 10, I'll go to vanilla and I'll say, what's an action that's very similar to what I'm doing? Is it bandaging? Is it crafting? Is it, um, you know, in this case, we're taking the saline blood target. So this would be the blood bag. And so I go and I grab something that's very similar to what I want because I don't know how to do animations. And B, there's really no good way of changing animations that don't exist. And so you got to find something that exists. And I'll copy that and then I'll paste it and I'll get rid of all the guts because again, we're inheriting from base classes. So continuous base and continuous base callback. And if you notice, this is vanilla. This is a constructor, which is just telling us what our action name is and like the animation, right? Like this is all just copy and paste. I haven't done anything to that. The callback just lets me change the time that it takes. So 2 seconds is what I chose. So what I have left open is basically the meat and potatoes of the work being done. All right. And so when I build something, you have behavior. My thing does this. And very often when people ask questions in DayZ, you'll hear Wardog or me or others say, well, when are you trying to do it? And the when is important because no matter what you build, you have to hook it into the base game somehow. And the best way is through events. And one of those events is actions. And so here, I've copy and pasted a continuous action, and I changed the onFinish progress server. So basically when the action is done, I do a very simple check to see, is the thing in hand my item? Simple sanity check. I can always assume it is because this action is only on my temperature scanner, but I am kind of anal like that. So this is kind of optional. I check to see if there's a player. 9 times out of 10, there's going to be a player. And then all I do is I say, player, what modifier do you have on you? And I set the state. So in terms of the surface area that my action is touching, I'm calling the same thing twice, and then this thing wants to reset it. Okay. Let me put these right next to each other. All right. The power of the concepts that I mentioned earlier is in this maintainability. My action is doing one thing and it's doing one thing well. It sets the scanner state. That's it. All right. And so when we talk about injecting or hooking into the base game, I personally like to try and hook into the smallest surface area as possible. Mainly because it reduces my risk of maintenance and things breaking. Oh, Solomon's got a question in that. It's about action conditions, but let's see if you'll talk about the end. Oh, I bet you $20 it's about the client server side aspect of it, huh? Because it's action conditions are kind of funky because they're run on the server and the client, but experience will show you that the server and the client don't always have the same visibility into things. So a good example is a server doesn't render anything. So it only knows like of positions. So like when you think of like a target, like am I looking at something? The server doesn't really know that you're looking at a door. Okay, I see. Yeah, a good example here is like the bunker doors, right? How do I know that my client is actually looking at a door to swipe a key card? Okay, this is a very common problem with new developers, usually with new commissions, because everyone wants to make a bunker door. And so in this case, the door itself is known on the server because it has a state. It's either open or closed. Okay, but it doesn't know that player number 34 is looking directly at a component or the mesh or the P3D that is the door. It just knows that the door is open or closed. And so there's this interesting middle ground inside of action condition where, since it's run on every frame on the client, but once an update loop on the server, there's desync, or for lack of a better word, the client knows more and the action condition is run more often than the server's action condition. And so you can get into scenarios where, actually, I'll just show it. When you're doing checks, why do you have to cast? Oh, Good question. Okay, so casting, earlier I mentioned inheritance and polymorphism. I didn't really touch on polymorphism, mainly because it's only useful for composition or later, so yeah. Anyway, so if we look at action data, let's go look at action data. What is an action, all right? Okay. So action data is a class that has a bunch of stuff in it and has action base. It has an item, which is named main item. So inside of this thing, there's a main item, there's a player, there's a target. And if you notice, that main item is an item base. Okay. Topic number one, point number one. Since it is a generic item, I know that my item, inventory base, there. I know that my item here is just a more specific shape of item base. Remember earlier we heard about inheritance. If I inherit from a parent, I get everything that it is. So when the game is setting up your action data, it just takes the generic item, which has a name and some other things, and stuffs it into this variable, m_main item. Okay. The problem is that item base does not have anything that is not override void. So item base has no notion of set scanner state or goober doober or reset scanner status. However, in my action, I need to be able to say, hey, item in your hand, change your state. Okay? Since item base doesn't have those functions, I have to cast to my more specific object. Okay? So that's the why. So why do I have to cast? I have to cast to my specific object because item base does not have goober doober, set scanner state, or reset scanner status. These are functions I wrote myself, not Bohemia. Now, what does the cast do? So the cast takes a variable, in this case my scanner, which is my temperature scanner color base, and it takes the main item, which is the item base, and it tries to stuff it through the shape. If you think about square peg, square hole, a square shape can fit through a circle shape can fit through a square hole. So that's kind of like what casting is. We're taking a similarly shaped object and we're running it through and conforming it and molding it to what we would call a unit temperature scanner. And since this returns a Boolean, if that works or not, yes or no, did you cast it? If it's yes, then okay, cool. My scanner object, my variable, has that shape now. It's no longer an item base, it's a temperature scanner. And since temperature scanner has set scanner state, I can now actually call it here, variable dot set scanner state. Okay, let me put these side by side. So that's the underlying mechanism as to why do I have to cast and how am I casting and what is the cast actually doing. So if we think of this, all things in the game are objects. Some of those are entity AIs. Some of those are going to be item bases. Some of those are going to be my custom item. And actually, I know there's nothing really other than item base. And so when we think of the hierarchy, all right, we have item base, there's like house, there's house, there's a building base, something like that. So if you can kind of see how it fans out a little bit, you start off with really generic stuff like all matter in the universe. And then there's like, well, some of that matter is apples and some of the, some of that is fruit. And then some of those fruits is apple, oranges, pineapples. And then maybe there's like a blood orange and, my banana apple. And that's kind of how the inheritance chain works. And so, again, the reason why we do this is because objects are very lightweight. the game can handle thousands, millions of objects at a time because the memory footprint is relatively low. Whereas if we were to store millions of custom items, we might have a little bit of, might have a little memory issues on our hands. This is kind of generic here. Again, I'm trying to speak to the audience, not to game developers. Did that answer the question? To satisfaction? Let's look at... does Bitterroot have a bunker door? I know DRIL had one. I deleted my DRIL mod, and I don't want to re-download it. Bunker entrance. Okay. Let's check out bunker entrance. Let's see if Bitterroot has it. So here is kind of me explaining and answering your question. Also demonstrating how you can take mods off of the workshop, unpack them, and inspect their guts. All right, this is something I do very often. Somebody comes out with a really cool mod, like, oh, how'd they do that? Did they go the easy route, or did they actually do it correctly? Or did they steal it from somebody else type thing? So, ideally you can, anything on the workshop you can download, right? You just saw me come into my workshop folder, I went into Bitterroot, I went into add-ons, and I unpacked it. And I used Macaros. Easy peasy. Let's go ahead and grab the stuff. I'll go and cut it. And I'll bring it into my P drive. And you might say, why, Tree? Why are you going to do that? Well, I want to be able to search it. I don't want to have to continue. I don't have to move through the files. Let's see. Okay, so no, this is just the door. Looks like there's something else to go along with it. Yeah, I'm trying to get an example of your bunker door. Bunker entrance. Oh, wait, maybe it's in building base. Action, build. Art. Ah, yes. Okay, cool. This is... Wait. Yeah. Okay. This is one. In the background, I will download DRIL and show you that one, because in my opinion, that's a little bit better to understand. And I also wrote it. Well, I'll download in the background. Okay. So when we talk about action condition and action condition continue, they run on the client and server. On the client, it runs on frame, which is 60 times a second, or however fast it's rendering. And on the server, it's run once per update, which is usually, I don't know. I haven't timed it, so I'm not going to say. But this creates an interesting paradigm inside the action condition when things don't exist on the server and they exist on a client. And in a very specific example is targets or components that I'm looking at. The game knows if I'm looking at an object, only the client knows what physical component I'm looking at. Okay. So here, if we're gonna read what the action build part is, I'm gonna write some English comments here so I know what's going on. If we are placing local, basically if we have toggled placing on a kit, or we are already in the middle of placing. Okay. All right. Is placing local is a convenience function. Basically, have we clicked the action to toggle placement, and then is placing server is, does the server know that we're in the middle of placement? Okay. Looks like there's already a comment here. If our legs are broken, then we return false. So that's a way to short circuit the condition. If the target object exists. Let's see, and there's an and here. So target get object can use construction build, and then the bang. So not. So if we cannot use the construction build, and we cannot use the construction build, or we can use hand construction. Okay, so this is looking like if we don't need to use a hammer to build, but we can use our hands to build. All right, so return false. And then here, if we are on the client, check complex building collisions with my specific part selection. I know from the variant ID, that's like when you scroll through options, this variant ID is what controls the option. Okay, so Solomon says, didn't answer any question, but I've learned a lot of this stuff. It's more about, let's say I created two conditions, A and B. I'd like players to not do the action if they got condition A, but if they got condition B, they could make the action even if they got condition A. Oh, you're talking about Boolean logic, right? So the best part about Boolean logic is that you can do this fairly easily by making variables. And what I mean by that is, so let's say I have bool condition 1. Let's do condition A. And for starters, we're going to say true. Bool condition B. True. Okay. Just writing what you said. You want it to work if A and B. Okay. So this was the first one. You'd like players not do the action if they got condition A. So if A, return false. This would short circuit the action. But you then say they get it, but if they get condition B, they should still be able to do condition A. So this is an order of operations, because you can just do if B. Return true. Otherwise, return false. There you go. So in reality, in my opinion, the way you have organized your conditions is the reason why this is confusing. In my opinion, condition A would be the one that's chosen first. I would just rename condition B to condition A. Or it's like, well, what if I want something like condition A, or sorry, I want condition, it can either be condition B or condition A and condition B, or something like that. Basically, I guess what I'm trying to get at is your Boolean logic is as simple as your variables. And if you can actually like drill them down to single things here, like this can just be like is colliding and is placing and is all right. These can be as complicated as you want. Turn them into variables. That way your Boolean logic gets really simple. And I would also say validate your conditions. Personally, when I'm building complex chains of logic, I will do something very similar like I will print out everything that I'm doing so that I know what's going on. Because sometimes my assumptions are incorrect. And that's another thing I wanted to kind of touch on, is that, like, as scripters, a lot of what we do, there are too many variables to account for. And so we place a lot of confidence in assumptions, things that we know, I use air quotes, know to be true because we've either done them in the past, or, you know, vanilla is good enough, right? Like, I know that it works. So I'm assuming that the code that I'm calling for vanilla works. But sometimes you have to validate those assumptions and make sure that what you think is happening is actually happening. So here I've put a print log that will print things out to, in this case, both the client and the server. And for the video's sake, your script logs for client are going to be in your app data folder, local DayZ. Boom. All right here. And a description of some of these. The RPT is like what the server is writing out for the most part. It shows the mods that are loaded. So, you know, you send this to somebody, you can easily see what mods they've loaded. It'll also go through and tell you stack trace. Crash log is kind of, this is just the list of crashes, not really useful unless you're looking to see a stripped down version of your script log. Script log is where your prints will actually print out to. This is where, like, I would go to see, did my print happen? Is my action happening? Like, am I validating my assumptions? That's for client. If I'm thinking about server, you go into your DayZ server, you go into whatever profile you started your server off in, and then the same full files are there, RPT, log, script. The RPT for a server is a little bit different. This is useful for seeing how the server is running your files. You can catch a lot of mistakes here if you were just to search your prefix. Things like, you can see the fact that I'm updating a lot of base classes. Right, updating base class inventory. Boom, done. Updating base class hockey stick. And so, like, you can actually tell a lot of what your mods are doing at runtime from these files. So whenever you hear me or the other scripters be like, print it out, log it out, like, that's what we mean. Very useful. Oh yeah, by default bool is false. That's a good one. Yep. And actually, let's talk about what a variable is in its life cycle. So if I do something like class, my class int I. All right, this is gonna have a value of null. This is null. Not good. Don't do this. In my opinion, dangling variables like that aren't immediately assigned, like, oh, I need to for declare this because in a for loop I'm going to use it to do some incrementing, stuff like that. That's fine. But if we're just going to, like, dangle a property up here, in my opinion, set it to 0, set it to -1, set it to a static value so that you know. Same thing with, like, arrays. Something like that. And to be fair, you shouldn't be doing arrays like this anyway. But things like bool b, that this will have a false value just because it starts out. But again, in my opinion, it's good to be declarative because you never know who's going to be reading your code, and you never know when you're going to be looking at your code 6-7 months from now. So, like, be declarative, be intentful. Okay. Oh, we probably have DRL loaded, yeah? Oh God. Wasn't even downloading. All right, well. Okay, RPC, that one's a lot easier, to be honest. RPCs can be used on anything. They are on objects, they are on players, and it's important to notice the difference because the player RPC and the object RPC are different. Different signatures, if I remember correctly. What did I just do in RPC for? Simple territories, that's right. No, order teleport. Okay, RPC. So RPCs, there are a few considerations to think about when you talk about RPCs. There is the params that you send through. Let's just go look at vanilla. Here we go. So get game. We have RPCs for single param. There is an RPC for when you need to pass through an array of params or anything else really. It's what we use to send objects across from client to server or server to client. Recently, I've been using RPCs for client selections for UI. You will always use RPCs for UI 5 mission stuff. When client clicks through options, makes a selection and saves, that is initiating an RPC to the server so that the server can update stuff, and then if there's any like callback that's needed. So again, there is a target. Where are we sending the RPC to? Is it a object? Is it a player? It could be any one of those things. The type. This is what will differentiate an RPC one from the other. You will most likely create your own enum or integer. The param is the data you're sending across the wire. Ideally, you want to make this as small as possible because sending payloads across the wire, internet, whatever is a heavy operation, more heavy than anything else in the game, and so these actions really have the possibility to impact server performance more than like something else. Bool guaranteed is a guarantee if it actually arrives or not. Sometimes you can just throw RPCs out in the wild like sounds or whatever. You don't really care if they get hurt or not. But in the case of my teleport, I want to let people know that they actually were teleported. Now, the recipient is important because are you sending this to a single person? Like to myself? Am I updating myself or am I updating the rest of the server? Again, not sending RPCs to the whole server is important if you don't need to. Oh yeah, and RPCs, the value here in the type needs to be unique across mods. This is another thing that can possibly cause issues, and it's one of the reasons why Community Framework was created to kind of standardize this stuff. You can really get into some trouble here if you choose an RPC that somebody else is using. You'll see some behavior that's kind of weird. Alrighty, so let's get into how to actually call it. Alrighty. Let's put these side by side so you can see signature and the data. Like this. There you go, Solomon. Yep. Oh yeah. So, this is me using an RPC to not have to write my own RPC. Okay, and so again, earlier you might have heard me say, I personally like to write as little code as possible because I don't want to have to maintain anything, and anything that I write at vanilla, I can be pretty confident that it'll work. So here I'm hijacking vanilla's warning for teleporting. So So if you throw a gas grenade and you log out inside of, or sorry, if you log out, you throw a gas grenade at that position and log back in, the game will teleport you to a quote unquote safe position. And so for me, I'm using that teleport message when a player moves outside of the bounds of the map. So they go out of 0-0 or they go out of the max height of the map. Okay. And so when we look at down here, what we have to supply to the function to get it to work, it needs a target. And so in this case, we're writing this function inside of the player. And so whenever you see the word this, the this refers to the class or the context of the function. And so in this case, the context of this function is the player. It's the object, it's the parent, it's the thing that's controlling all of this this code. If we were inside of my temperature scanner, the this would refer to my temperature scanner. Okay, so and this is always, the keyword is always present no matter what. It's always there. It's just implicit, kind of like when you give a declarative statement like go to the store or like move out of the way. You is usually in front of, like implicitly put in front of there. You move out of the way. So in this case, the context for this function is the player. And so I put this. The type of the RPC is RPC warning teleport. And if I were to look at all the other types of RPCs, you'd see there's a big old list of them. Starting, ending, dialogue. So this is just one RPC out of the many. Okay, any params that I'm sending through? Null, I have no parameters I'm sending through. This is the server, or excuse me, the client telling the server, and the server then telling the client, hey, you're out of bounds. There's really nothing, no data to pass on. It's just a warning message. Guaranteed, Boolean, I want to guarantee that the player gets it. And the recipient, if I didn't have this get identity here, anytime a player moved outside of the boundary of the map, it would send this RPC to all players. And so I don't want that to happen. I only want it to happen to that one player moving out of the bounds. And so I get identity. Get identity is a vanilla function that returns us the identity of a player. It has the Steam ID, has some other unique information, has their Steam name, things like that. Very useful, but it's required here for an RPC. And so we put this all together. We have a single param RPC being invoked on the player, telling us to teleport. We're passing no data. We guarantee that it's expected to arrive for this specific player. And that's an RPC. Now, how does this get consumed? How does the server consume this code? All right. So if we go back to the player base and I search vanilla, I come into player base and we see this function called onRPC. And in onRPC, there's tons of actual RPCs because the player does a lot of stuff, a ton of stuff. I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to collapse all these, and oh, lo and behold, vanilla DayZ has a notion of teleporting, which I mentioned earlier, and it's going to catch the condition of that RPC. It's going to check to see if we have the ability to open a UI. It's going to enter that scripted menu, and then it's going to let us sort of close things, and that's it. And then the code continues to run and then breaks out here at the very end. And that's the RPC. In my opinion, the RPC is a lot simpler than the NetSync, just because it is usually only in two places where it has two things. So you send the RPC and then you consume it. Whereas with a NetSync, you got to register your variable, you got to do on variable synchronize, you got to set sync dirty, and then you got to kind of connect it up. This is an RPC on the player. What about an RPC on an object? Very similar. If I can find it. Okay. Sorry for the formatting. This is some of my old code that was on two space tabbing, so it's going to look kind of gross for a minute. Okay. So this is me doing RPCs in a different paradigm. So same approach, but we are controlling the flow of where data is going and when it's being consumed. And so the background of this specific object, it's a crafting bench. The user is able to attach items to the bench and then scroll through a list of items. Okay. Now, the important thing here is when I attach things to a bench, I need to be able to update the recipes that are shown on the client. And so I have an RPC to handle this this mechanism of what is available and what can the player make. And so if we were to break this down, the server tells the client that a recipe info has changed in some capacity. All right. The client handles that by saying, check my recipes that are available. The bench consumes the RPC very similar to the player by grabbing the RPC type, handling the RPC that it cares about, and then continuing on. And so and this is a smaller example of where in the player base you have a ton of RPCs that you have to handle. In this case, anytime I attach something to, or the quantity of my bench changes, my server then sends an RPC to the client and says, update your recipes, do it now. And it does it. And so if there's any questions on that, let me know. Let's see. So really, if there's anything I can like hammer on in terms of scripting, it's a lot of reading, to be fair. Like there's really no shortcut to scripting. There's only I guess accelerations. I mean, the only reason I would say maybe even decent at it is that my professional career, I've been programming for over 10 years. And so like the basics of how the game are built, I understand. And so it's easy for me to look at the vanilla code and say, oh, I can read that. But I'm hoping that I've shown today how you can slowly pick anything out of the game. In this case, I'm just going to go look at bark and just look at it, read it, try to understand what it's doing. Like, what is bark color base? Control shifting F, in my opinion, is probably one of the most powerful things in the game. Like being able to crawl up the chain so I know the item I want. Bark oak. Okay, well, what does it inherit? Bark oak color base. Okay, well, what does bark oak color base inherit? Well, it inherits item base. So it has all of these things. And so it shouldn't feel scary if you've done one item. If you've done one item, it should feel comfortable to do another item because they're all the same. Oh, here's another important one, type def. I think this is a common pitfall for new developers. What is it? Oh, that's right. Type def inventory underscore base. Or is it inventory base type def? I can't remember the order. Just do .c. There we go. I saw it a second ago. Here we go. Okay. Type def. Okay. So this is something that'll trip up new people all the time. And so inheritance, right? It is important, so important that we ask ourselves, what is it a name, and shift things into other things. Okay. So if you remember earlier,
I'll get to ref after this. If you remember earlier, we mentioned inheritance was important, all right? And if we notice that editable base inside of the config CPP inherits from inventory base, all right? And so some of you might be wondering, well, inside of scripts, everything is called item base. And that would be a very astute observation, because what you're seeing here is Image is really bad at naming. Like, and how static things are once you name them. And so in my opinion, what we're seeing here is tech debt, 10 plus years of tech debt. And in the configs, probably when we ported this from, I don't know, Arma, or maybe when the game was first made, they named this inventory base, and inside of scripts, it was inventory based. But at one point they probably changed something because, you know, we were fixing stuff, and the item based concept was created. And in the script side, we're essentially masking item base as a rename or an alias for inventory base. And so this is important because you will often hear us say, if it's defined in the config and you have the base class defined in scripts, that's good enough. You don't need a new definition for each item. So like a good example, color base, t-shirt color base. Oh, actually, this is a bad example because they defined all of them. Technically, you don't need to do this. Technically, it's good practice to do that, because in my opinion, if you're writing an object, you should expose its class level implementation to this. But technically, you don't, because again, since inheritance from config CPP and in the script files, the .c's, this magic will just work for all of them. So I'm not going to touch on that one more, just because I'd like to get to refs. But that'll be on another video if you care about it. Okay, refs. What are refs and why do we care about them? Oh my gosh. Refs are probably the bane of most modders' existence. And for a new modder, they can be quite daunting because, again, you don't have the basics to understand why even refs exist in the first place. So I am going to quickly, in the layman's term, explain memory and memory management and why refs exist and why they're important in general. So like TLDR, okay? Some of you programmers out there are probably gonna roll your eyes at this, but the TLDR here is your computer has a bunch of RAM. All right, you have 16 gigabytes, you have 32 GBs, man, you've downloaded your RAM and you're ready to go. All right, and so I like to logically think of memory registers as 64-bit blocks, right? Most operating systems nowadays are 64-bit, so you can think of each register as having 64 little blocks that can hold a 1 or a 0 or whatever. All right, and you have, 32 gigs of that, okay? And so what happens when a game starts is that it'll be like, hey man, I need like this much RAM, all right? And so DayZ's like, I get 8 gigs of RAM. And it's reserved that for the runtime of the game, right? It loads up, base stuff, and you have like 2 GB at the beginning of when your game's loaded, kind of just sitting in memory. But eventually there's extra stuff for, things to happen, okay? All right, so that memory, that big list of memory here is shared. Okay, and it's shared between what we would think of as like human memory, like I remember I went to the store yesterday and I got eggs, versus I need to remember to, like, right now that I have that I need to walk to like the door or something. Like I need to do things right now, versus I need to like remember things that have happened. And that's kind of the layman way of understanding. And so we have broken it into 2 conceptual pillars. There is something we call the stack, and there's something we call the heap. And I like to visualize them as one starting from the ground. I'm stacking things up from the ground, As I invoke my functions at runtime, I am building my stack. I start at DayZ game, I call run, I move down into the play function, I create a new object, I keep moving into the call stack. If you've seen an error, actually, a good way to showcase what a call stack is to show an error. Crash. That is not a good one. Nope. Not another good one. Live editing. Okay. We'll get a good one, I promise. It'll make it much simpler to understand. Okay. This error right here is what we would call a call stack. Actually, you can even see stack trace. Okay, we are tracing the calls the system is making as it's going through the stack. And so, if you think about the bottom of the stack, I don't know why that's there. This is the most recent call. This is what called the one above it. This is what called the one above it. This is what called the one above it. And this is what called above it. And since there's nothing below it, I have to assume that this is what originated the call. All right. And so if you were to look at that, we have made a call. That call made another call. That call made another call. That call made another call. Till eventually we come to the place where it does some work. Like in my case, maybe I set the status of the scanner or I make an RPC call. And all along the way, while we're adding things to the stack, I might need to put I need to remember the value 8. Or I need to remember the value 42. And so the heap is something that we would use to store data onto. Okay, and the whole reason why I'm explaining this is because as you're adding things to the stack, as you're calling things in your code, and as you're saving things, eventually, if you do too much, they'll converge in the middle. And you get heap corruption errors, right? And we've all seen this error, where our heap is corrupted and the game just crashes. Now, it's not caused specifically by this, but it's an artifact of the way memory is managed and trying to access things that might not be there. And this is where refs come into play, okay? Because when we think of adding things to a stack and then add something on top of the stack, we're really building references. Or for this specific case, we have references to things. And that would be like over here, and you could also have references to your stack. But in reality, you need to be able to remember where you've been and what you're doing, okay? And so that's where refs come into play. Shit. So what's a good use of what's a good use of a ref? Okay. Why would we need to use one? Well, an obvious example of a ref needing to be used is arrays. Okay, let's just look for a ref array in vanilla. Let's see if we can find a good one. I have a couple examples we can use. Okay. So character names, that's a good one. So you can see here in DayZ game, okay, there's a bunch of variables. Not sure a ton what an array is. Oh, an array is just a list of items. Like, don't complicate arrays. Arrays, literally, list of items. And the index always starts at 0. That's it. It's a list. Doesn't have to be more complicated than that. In this case, I have a list of integers, For an array of integers, if I had, you know, string for that one, I could do an array of, you know, just do strings if I wanted to. And if I go back here, one might notice that you have refs. You don't really have refs on bools or strings or floats or integers. And that would be an astute observation. And the reason why is because we have a differentiation between data types. Like we have something called primitives and complex. I'm not sure. I forget where the other one is. I just call them objects. You have primitive values and then you have objects. And so primitives are like static values. One is a primitive value. It's one. It's a symbol. It represents a value. Whereas a vector is an object. It represents two values, an x and a y. A string technically is an object, but in DayZ, it doesn't seem like it is. But in reality, it's a char array, a character array, or array of characters that create a string. That's outside of this discussion. However, arrays, lists of things, or a complex object like the temperature manager or noise parameters, or in my case, config objects. You know, maybe a config for my face paint options. I need to be able to remember that I created it, okay? And so, if I go back to my example here, let's say I start the game. Okay. And then server loads. And then load my config. Okay. And then like the game loop started type stuff. And you can kind of see that I've written them out here so that they are in like a waterfall. So one happens after the other, and then the game loop kind of starts after the server's loaded, more or less. And as I'm going into my call stack, the things that I do or the objects that I create only exist inside of that scope. Okay, and scope is important because that's how references are created, that's how references are counted, and that's how the game knows when it can delete an object in memory that is referenced. Okay, and so given the way I've sort of listed things out, if I were to create a variable inside of load my config, then I didn't give it a hard reference, basically telling the engine to remember my value. Eventually, once this function finishes, kicks out, the game will drop that memory, just garbage collected, and I will lose my data, and I'll most likely get a null pointer or one of the errors that says I know I created my array, but I can't access any values in it because there are none there. Well, that's a scope issue. The game essentially nulled out your values, and you only have the base reference left. So, how do I make it so that my references are saved? Okay. Let's get to that. Okay. Oh, let's get to a simpler example. Yeah, okay. Here we go. So when we think about creating a configuration, DayZ gameplay, DayZ game, here we go. And filling it. Sorry, I'm just getting my stuff set up. So we're looking at a configuration right here for some data that gives a server owner the ability to set up locations in a map, right? I can supply an XYZ, and then that X, Y, and Z will do something special. It doesn't really matter what it's doing. I just want to be able to do something with it. Okay? And so I've created an object to hold that data. All right. I have a string, I have an integer, I have a vector. And I do this because it's much easier to save a list of objects that look the same than trying to like make a map that handles more data. This is just an easy way of shoving data into one spot. And so like I've created a class, I've given it these values, I set these values up, and all these functions down here are just simple getters and setters, Boolean conditions. Like these are trivial things. Like again, me using encapsulation to ensure that my data is in a single spot, and it's small. Okay, so this is just the shape of the data. It's just a plain data object. There's nothing special about this, in my opinion. Like nothing novel. Now where it starts to get novel and important is when I begin to use that data. And so I kind of double click this object. You can see that it highlights down here in what I call a manager. Okay, and so I like to split things up in this way, again, to keep things simple and to just make them more easily communicatable. So my data object is up here. I have a manager that holds a couple of these data objects, and I need to be able to save them. And if you notice here, I have a reference for the array, but I also have a reference for the object inside of the array. And I have to do this because it's a complex object. If this was like a string or an int array, I wouldn't need that. But since this is a complex object, I need a reference to the objects in the array. I also need a reference to the array itself. All right, so let's go ahead and differentiate between those two. Let's do floats, just because I like floating. Okay. All right, so I'll make sure to explain that for the video again. I don't need a reference for the float because it's a primitive. The value, it's stored in memory. But I do need a reference to the array itself. Because eventually, if you notice here, we're not instantiating it, and we're going to create it somewhere else, which means we're going to create it inside of a scope that isn't this main class level scope. So we have a reference to it, a hard reference. We look up to our bioflowers here, which has the complex object. We need a reference to the complex object because technically, if we go back to that memory picture, the values aren't stored the same way. And so we need a hard reference to where this is stored in memory. But then we also need a reference to where the actual array is stored as well. Okay. And again, we need the reference to the array because it's not created here. It's actually created over here when the game starts. Okay. So when we're creating the configuration for the first time, all right, we say new config, new manager. We create the new array out here. Again, it's outside of the scope. This is important. If you need a visual representation of scope, use the brackets. If you're inside of a bracket, you're inside of scope. So if I were to say int scope 1, and if I did int scope 2 here, and then something like int scope 3, these variables are defined in different scopes or contexts, whichever one you want to say, and so I can only access them within the proper scope. And so since these brackets here are helping me visualize what does that scope even cover, like what's the area of the scope, like where does the variable live, scope 1 lives inside of this these yellow brackets at the top. I could technically say print scope 1 here, and it will work. I could do it here, and I won't get in trouble. But if I were to try and say like print scope 3 over here, or even scope 2, I would get errors. It would error out to me. And the reason why is because if I were to collapse this, my scope is gone. The variable's gone. Technically, we can't see it, right? Neither can the code. And that's important to realize, because it's another common pitfall for new devs, new scripters, is they will put variables inside of a function and be like, why can't I use it? Well, it's because it's out of scope. And this is lightly touching on why refs are important, because for primitives, it's not that big of a deal, but for objects like arrays or complex data payloads, when you create it outside of the scope, right, this bioflower variable, it's created actually all the way over here in DayZ game. I need to be able to keep a reference to it, because otherwise, once the game hits this bracket down here, it's gonna dereference or descope everything that was created in here. So if I had like a variable, my fun int equals 5, like this integer right here, like in memory, is like gone after this bracket. I can't access it anymore. And so if I didn't have this ref here on these arrays, what would happen is what I just said. We would go through, we'd make a new object, we'd make a new array, we would fill it with data, we would exit this scope, and then somewhere down the line, we would try to access it, and it would be empty. And then, you know, we come to the scripters Discord, Enforce Discord, and go, oh, my array's not working, why is the game broken, you know? And in reality, it's because we didn't have a reference to the array. A way to remember that it happened outside of the scope of our function here, outside of our brackets, right? Like anything outside of these brackets inside of this class doesn't see. And that's kind of one of the basics of programming and reference and memory management and things like that. Like refs are actually a very complex topic, and one of the hardest parts of programming, in my opinion. Anyway, that's refs in a nutshell. Nine times out of 10, you're only going to use a ref on a class level variable because you need to do something with it later, and it's usually on lists or maps, things like that, or on other objects that you need. Like if you look at player base from DayZ themselves, you'll see a lot of refs on objects like underground handler, because this is definitely created outside of the game. And it's a nice way of making it so that the player doesn't need their own reference. You know, if it's like on the server, right? You can have a single manager handle all players instead of a player handling its own manager. That's a nice optimization you can have. That would be a level of abstraction on your code, things like that. So, any questions? It's kind of a complex topic. I hope I answered the question well enough. A bunch of refs right here. And every now and then you'll see a ref that's not supposed to be there, but we don't talk about those. Oh, nice. Yeah. Basically me. I spent a lot of time just crawling vanilla. You never know what they add. They're always adding new stuff. What happens if using ref inside of a scope? Okay, good question. Good question. Yeah. This kind of goes back on to why does ref even... Yeah, why is ref even needed? Yeah, and just like Steve said, the ref keyword is never required in local scope. So inside of the brackets, you never need ref. Like if the array my object Yeah, like this is wrong. Definitely wrong. And I could probably see somebody being like, oh, well, I want to do this so I can access array in this other function over here. Like, I could see this coming up. People being like, oh, well, I create the array here and I need to be able to use it over here. Just like Steve said, you've created the array inside of this scope, inside of these brackets. So if I'm using the array within the local scope, you're good. You don't need the ref. But if you need to use it outside, in my opinion, that's promotion. That's an event for like, okay, well, maybe I need to rethink how I'm architecting my code, designing it. I might need to pull it out. Right, and then there's this notion of, do I eager instantiate or do I lazy load? Because I mean, you could technically just, hey, you could do this. This would work, right? This would work without a ref. However, if you are a lazy loader like some people, you might do something like this, in which case you will need a ref. Because you will be filling this array and you're creating it outside of the scope it's created. Right, and so like if you're doing, oh, I see Steve typing. I'm wrong. No, ignore you. All right. But yeah, you would need the ref here because you're creating it. You're creating outside of the scope, essentially. Because like what would happen is if you didn't have the ref, okay, you have the variable, and this would work, but the new object that you create would be lost after you exit this bracket. Okay. Because again, brackets signify scope. So if anything I create inside of here is basically gone-ish. If it's not a primitive. So like, again, that's why primitives are important, because if I have like int, right, like primitives on the other hand are different. We save these values in memory. So you don't need the ref, because you can directly go to that, that 64-bit register and be like, what's your value? And be like, oh, my value is 43. Okay, cool. Whereas if it's like a string, it's like, okay, what characters are in your registers? And like, that's a little bit different. So anyway. Let's see, what's a bad ref? This would be a bad ref. Refing string. Okay. Oh yeah. Sorry. I got off track. Why is the ref important to begin with? The ref is important because the way the garbage collector works is it is counting references, and references that are at 0 can be dereferenced. And that's how memory management works. I mean, on a nutshell, right? And so how do I know if I have a reference to something? Well, I have a reference to something if it's being used by something. So a good example is, let's just make a new file together. Control Z. Okay. So let's say we have class A. Okay. And inside of my scope, outside of the scope, I say, actually, let's do this. class B. Void B, right? We got to have our constructor. And inside of my constructor, I'm going to say A, new A, or actually we'll just do A1 equals new A. Okay, so we have a variable called A, and technically on our, when I say something like new B, and the compiler runs this and the runtime starts, right? A is going to be created, it's going to be assigned to memory, and we're going to be good to go. If I put a debugger right here on this one line, this A1 variable would have a value for this split second. And if I had like some function 1, right, and I tried to like print A1, right, first off, I'm going to get a compiler error. So let's resolve the compiler error. Cool. So our class B has a variable, A1. And so if I call this function right now, and if I run this program, and I say something like b dot func, right? If I call b dot function 1, A1's going to be null. Okay. You might be like, oh, well, tree, we created it inside the constructor. Like what's that? And I would say, well, you created it and you gave it, you assigned it memory, but as soon as the scope was, as soon as we exited the scope, we lost this reference. And in fact, I'm doing a poor job of explaining this because the simple is so trivial. The example is so trivial. Let's do it with this instead. Okay. Bioflower manager. Where is it? Where did it go? There we go. Sorry. Okay. Here we go. So let's assume if I didn't have either of these refs here, okay? I don't have any refs on my stuff. And so when the game runs and it creates a bioflower manager, this class right here, class B or whatever I was talking about earlier, we made a new one. It's outside of our scope. It's well outside of anything we know of inside of here. Okay, and we're creating new stuff. Let's go and get rid of this ref, get rid of this ref. And so we create a new object. At this point, reference counter +1. Okay. For that specific object. And I say it's +1 because it exists in memory. We use the new keyword. Memory allocation was happening and it exists in memory as a shape. Okay. There might not be data there, but at least there are cubby holes to fill with data. Okay. Next line. Oh, look at that. We actually start filling it with data. We allocate some amount of RAM that says, hey, we want an array here. Okay. Now here we have our reference counter for bioflowers, right? And I'm being very explicit here because they each have their own little reference. Okay. +1. And then the next lines, we actually start pushing data into the memory. Like, so we basically went to some cubby holes and we said, okay, these are cubbies that we're going to use for some data. And now the lines that I've highlighted, we're actually pushing data into the cubby holes. So in here we have bioflower object, plus 1. Okay. We'll copy that, because as we're adding to the array now has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 references. Or I should say 5 references. It has 5 items inside of its list. Just remove that. It's a bad explanation for that. For now. But remember, we're calling new on an object. And so this is what that second ref is for, but we're not going to talk about it now. Okay. Now what happens is when we leave this bracket here, we exit the scope of the current stack, current frame or whatever. This reference here, without something keeping track of that reference, again, without my main class having the reference, there's nothing telling the compiler that it should be keeping track of it. Okay, we call this a weak reference. You'll see that in code all the time in your logs. Value not saved or whatever due to weak reference. This right here is what it means. Weak reference. We have incremented our reference counter somewhere else in the code. We then exit that stack and we've lost the reference. But how do we fix this? The fix is actually relatively easy. We just use a ref. I go back to where the array is defined in my config. I put ref in front of the array. I need to make sure I do the same thing here. And I actually create the array. And now what we've done is this ref here is basically like a checkpoint or a save point. I'm kind of hand waving my way around some things here, but with this ref here and this ref here, we essentially, for lack of better words, we give it a +2. Because as soon as we exit this scope, we're going to decrement the reference counter by 1 because this one inside of this scope is gone, but we still have another reference outside of it. We call this a strong reference, okay? Something else is handling the main reference to the object on memory, okay? And all a reference is just a pointer. I go back to my awesome drawing. This line right here, from the stack to the heap, that's what we call the reference. That's a reference right here, this line. All it is just a way for the computer to go from one to the other. So this keyword is what enables us to create complex objects outside of our originating scope. Okay. So we're not done, because again, we'll run the code again, and then eventually we'll run, and we won't get that weak reference error on the array. We'll get it for the things that we're pushing into the array. And that's important because if this was just strings, we wouldn't get that error. Because again, we can store string inside that memory, no problem. I think. I can't remember off the top of my head. I'm not sure. But I know for instant floats and bools. All right. So what's going to happen now is when we run our code, our array is going to stay. And in the rest of our code, we'll be able to access the array. But the items that we push into it, the data, will not be present. And we'll be like, why is it not working? And we'll come to DayZ modders and be like, hey, I have a ref on my array. I know it should be working, but anytime I access the array, even though I push in data, it's not there. And you'll get me coming and be like, oh, well, you probably don't have a ref on your main object. Because again, right here, when we create a new object, we're essentially building it into the memory. And if I don't have a reference to that memory point for complex objects, for non-primitives, I will lose that reference as soon as I exit my bracket, my scope. So how do we fix that? Well, it's easy. We will add, if I Control Z, a ref to the object itself. And this will complete out our complex object configuration. All right. And the reason why this works, again, is because as we're creating new objects inside of the array, something else is holding onto the reference of that object. And what is holding onto it? Well, it's the declared object over here, back in our configuration. It's the manager. It controls the references. And so the TLDR, if you don't, you're only paying attention to a little bit of this and you're skipping through the video. Reference counters counts the references. References at 0 can be dereferenced and deleted. References at 1 are still held onto. In the case of reference problems, you are usually running into a reference problem because you're creating an object, not an integer, boolean, or float, somewhere else from where you declared your variable. And I say declare explicitly because declaring and defining are two distinct options. Declaring is like Michael Scott in The Office yelling out, "I declare bankruptcy." What I've just wrote here, string s, that is a declaration. I am declaring that a string s exists in the world. Defining is saying string s is equal to test. Okay. And I only bring this up because this is usually the prime case for why references are needed in the first place. You are declaring your intent, and then you are defining it elsewhere. And that's 9 times out of 10 the only reason you need a ref. All right, and that's Tree's refs in a nutshell. Pretty complex subject. If you've ever taken C++, it's the reason why I don't like C++. I prefer Rust, where your pointers don't matter. Control Z all this stuff. Is there other documentation, like more stuff to learn how it's all described here? No, unfortunately not. And honestly, I don't think that there will ever be, mainly because the code base itself is the best documentation. So I've modded for a couple games now. Grand Theft Auto, Minecraft, RimWorld, Factorio, and they all have docs, like a thing that's auto-generated from their code that explains what's happening. And in my opinion, that is a disservice to the modding community, mainly because I need to know how the game is built in order to understand how to build mods for or how to modify it. And so, man, anytime people in DayZ, like often people in brainstorming or scripting, they'll ask a question. Like here, let's take an example. Question. Oh yeah, here's Wayland. Wayland, quick question. I never made a crafting recipe before, but there are loads of examples to refer to. My question is, can I make a crafting recipe of an item that produces more than one result? Okay, so somebody stated their intent, they have a question, and in my opinion, this is a perfect example of using our monkey brains to deduce this information. So like, I'll think of myself, if I can't think of a recipe, I know cutting up pumpkins gives me some, but if I can't think of a recipe, I'll do something like let's search the base files for recipe. Okay, cool. I see register recipe. Well, that's with DayZ horse. Let's go and close out a bunch of these and get to vanilla. Okay, so here's recipes. Here's a crafting manager. That's probably not what I want, but get valid recipes. Oh, okay, looks like we're doing logic on recipes. So can I find... what it's being done on? Recipe count, get valid recipes. No, dead end. Okay, well that's fine. We'll just keep going. Maybe, oh, look it. I just happened on recipe base. Oh, sweet, recipe base, better search term. Let's go class recipe base. Looks like there is a base class for recipes. I come into my Explorer. I go directly to where it's in DayZ. Oh, look, Wow, look at all these recipes that I have. Okay, well let's I'll just, man, feathers. That looks like one. Bone bait. And so now I can come in here and be like, oh, well, this is how a recipe must be created. We have an ingredient, we have an ingredient, we have result. Oh, add result. You know what? Let's search to see if I can find any instances where add result is in the same file twice. Look at that. Add result, add result, add result. Armbands. Look at that. So given a flag base and a knife, I can now see that, oh, if I want to add more results to a recipe, I just need to call add result multiple times. And like, to me, scripting is all about that problem solving mentality, being curious, not letting dead ends kind of discourage you, and then experimenting. So in this case, like, oh, if I'm new, I probably won't understand why these values, like in the brackets, are different between 0, 1, and 2. Like, I personally know that arrays start at 0, 0, 1, 2, and you know, the result, the first result, the second result, the third result, and those correspond with it. But like, for somebody new, that might be a question on the Discord they ask, like, why is there a 0 in between this bracket, or why is there a 1 in between that bracket? Like, that's a good question in my opinion, because it showcases that you understand something about this, but this one thing is kind of like a quirk and you're wondering why. That's a good question. Solomon says, could you have a challenge just like a homework exercise for the subjects talked about in each session, so we actually work on what you learned? Goodness, what did we talk about? Talked for 2 hours. Jesus. It's kind of hard to give an example for refs other than, well, configs are a pretty good example of refs, because mainly they're created in 5 mission when the server starts, and then they're accessed in 4 world for actions or for behavior, and they're defined in 3 game. So in my opinion, that's a really good separation of concerns to help highlight some of these things. So like, if you think about, when I think about making a configuration file, I think of static values that never really change. So that's like game information. So like, in this case, my face paint, I have that stuff defined here. And then in my mission, we have the notion of when the server starts, grab the config or generate it, and then when clients connect, send it to them. And that's about it. And then in 4 world, it's like, if I need to do something, grab it. And you're seeing me heavily abuse encapsulation, because I personally like keeping things atomic, independent, and individual. And some people like keeping it all in one spot. So technically you could do a lot of this in just 5 mission in the init-C. I mean, there's nothing stopping you, but the flexibility of that approach is very minimal, and you can't change things very easily. Can I explain how one could change the option that is displayed first in the one that needs to scroll to use it when crafting? There are mods that change stuff being made from pelts, or how can one move a recipe down? Oh, you're talking about the action variant. So there are 2 ways to approach this. If I have a recipe that has the same ingredients, DayZ will naturally give you a scroll option. So let's say I have, let's just look for rags. Rag. Rag rope. So I'm not sure if I can find a useful one right here just off the top of my head, but I do know that if you have recipes with the same ingredients and a different result, you will get a scroll option. in the recipes. However, do note that there is a 20 recipe max for that strategy. You can only have 20 recipes that have the same ingredients. Not sure where that hard limit is, but I found that limit out when I was trying to make recipes for armbands, for double armbands with mass, and we have like 400 armbands. And so I had to think of a different way of giving players the options. And so luckily, Bohemia DayZ devs gave us that option with the variant ID and the variant action variant manager, which is really awesome. Oh, you're talking about the order of actions themselves? No, I don't know of any way of ordering the actions. I think that's still I think that might be alphabetical. But yeah, you can't reorder actions. It's an unfortunate one. I half was expecting the action base to eventually get an ordinal ID, but that seems pretty low priority compared to some of the things. Let's get to the action variant manager. So this thing is really cool. This mechanic, I use it all the time. If I can find it. Base paints. Scripts. Continuous. Paint face. Okay. So if you want to see some freaking magic, all right, here is some freaking magic. Hold on. Nope, not there. Sorry. Wrong one. Stand by. In my opinion, what I'm about to show you is probably one of the best hidden secrets of DayZ. And I need to get the better one. Okay, cool. Okay. So like any other action, you have the ability to give the user a scroll wheel option for a list of things. So like player looks at a book or looks at something and they get a scroll wheel list of actions to do, picking from a list. And in my case, I have like a list of books, or we'll do a better one, armbands. This is a better one. So like most servers have more than 20 armbands, and most servers probably want the ability to give their members the option to craft their armbands. And so in this case, we have a update invoker. So first off, the script invokers in DayZ are freaking sweet. They're kind of like delegates if you're familiar with coding. It's just a way of calling code when you need to on like an event. It just gives you the ability to build your own events. So the variant manager on actions has the notion of a script invoker for updating the list of actions to show a player. All right. In this case, you can name the method wherever you want, and I call it on update actions just because I want it to update the actions. Okay. So first off, you got to tell the variant manager that you have things that it wants to change. Cool. We've connected up a function. So anytime we update our actions, we say get the count of options. All right. This is a pre-optimization. Okay. So of all the options I can see, set the total count. This is what limits our scroll wheel. All right. Scaffolding. On action info update. Vanilla function I'm overriding here. Okay. This is what changes the text you see next to your click option. Okay. And so in most cases, craft armband, no option. If I have a stack of rags, that's the target, and the action is on a sewing kit. And so if the sewing kit is basically in the main hand, if there's at least one rag in the stack, if the sewing kit has some quantity, all right, get the options that the player can technically craft. This is just a list of strings, okay? Kind of shoehorning in here. There are better ways to do this, but basically I give it a list of strings. And the variant ID, all right, M variant ID is vanilla, all right? And this is just magic right here. Okay, on the client, M variant ID represents the index of my selection, all right? 0 through whatever the count was that we set up here, okay? And all I do there is we set the text that we see to just format based on the color of object. Okay, so this is what changes the crafting action text. On action info update. The condition, very simple. Do you have rags? Do you have quantity? Yes or no? Already showed you the get armband options. This is just a list of the color bases. I'm abusing the fact that I can just concatenate armband underscore with the color and it'll create the item. Okay. So that was the magic right there that I showed you. The M variant ID, that's the client side magic. The server, on the other hand, has no notion of the client selection, all right? That's the kicker. And this is where, again, why we haven't seen this mechanism out in the wild as much, because this value isn't synced by default. Okay? So I have to do some special stuff to get it on there. Well, how do you do that? Well, you create your own action data, okay? And by doing that, well, when the action itself is creating its action data, I stub in my own data, which if you look up at the top here, where did I define that? Oh, yeah, okay. So if you notice here, I am inheriting from action data, and I am inheriting from action received data. So nothing special there. I'm pulling everything that the parent has, but I am adding my integer, which represents that variant ID. And since I do this in several mods that are independent, I have to rename it independently. So not a big problem, and it's kind of lightweight, so it's no big deal. So this is all I'm doing to get to connect this vanilla mechanism up. I'm just passing the integer data from the client to the server, okay? How do we do that? Well, when the action is creating its action data, okay, due to the inheritance concept we talked about at the very beginning, all right, we can use abstraction and polymorphism to just pass around action data. But since my custom object is inheriting from the action data, I'm able to stub that in instead. Okay. So now when we actually set up the action, when the action starts, my thing's here and I shove the variant ID into it. That's all I do. I say, whatever the client has, just push it in there. Nothing complex. When we write the context, the action data context from client to server, I make sure that I cast it to my object so that I can push and write that data through. This is important. This is what actually sends or ensures that the server receives my variant ID. Now, when we read the data from the client, we need to be able to interpret it. And so, very carefully, we will read from the context, calling super. And then, since I know that I added my data onto it afterwards, right here, right? We write the data, and we write vanilla data, and then we write my data. And so, consequently, we will read vanilla data, and then we will read my data. After that point, my action data has this value. And this handle receive data is how the server handles receiving the data. And that's essentially what allows me to, in my onFinish progress server, when the action finishes, I can say, cast my action data to my custom action data, pull out the variant, the specific client selected option, and use that to build my armband. And so I mentioned earlier, I just take the color, concatenate it to armband underscore, and I create the item, and then I reduce the quantity of the rags and the sewing kit. So not much code was added to sort of hook this up. It's just an order of operations and understanding how the RPC works to actually write this data out. Questions? There's a thread in scripting that outlines this as well. This was one of my favorite parts of the engine, of the actions, in my opinion. This really enables you to do some cool stuff. In one function you had action receive data called before super. I thought you always call super first in order of operations. So that's a good observation, yeah. So let's dive into that a little bit. Why would I call action receive data first, especially with it being in the shape of my object? And the reason is because I want to make sure that this object, or variable I should say, has everything read from the server. So if I did something like this, what would happen is we would read the data into this object right here that's passed in, and then right afterwards I would create a new object, essentially nulling it out and making a new one. So we would lose everything from the database read or from the reading function. And so I do it here to ensure that whatever this is fully populated. And there's another thing. So other people might be saying, well, don't you null out what is pushed into this function? And I would say, yes, that's one reason why you would take the name, function name, and you'd go to where it's defined. So we're looking at action continuous base. And I would need to do this. And actually, you might have picked out a bug here. I might need to do something like take this and cast it to my value, then push it through. So, so yeah, that's actually a good call. I appreciate. So this is one reason why I really like doing these types of things, because again, scripting in our world is built on assumptions, and so often when you make an assumption, you continue forward and stop like challenging that assumption. And so I really enjoy like newer devs and newer people looking at the code because they ask questions and challenge my assumptions. And this is a bug, so I really appreciate that. Sweet. Looking forward to making each car door to be made into a plate. Okay, so with car doors, right? Cars are special. They don't have very good inheritance. Oh, but it looks like you have car door here in script, so you might just be able to make a single recipe for a car door and just use this. Just say car door, pliers, and then like metal plate, and that would kind of work on all doors, I think. Don't quote me on that. I don't do anything with cars because cars are very that's Tyson's thing. And that's another cool thing about scripting, is that the code base is so large and the purview of the game engine is so large. Like, I personally don't touch guns. I don't touch vehicles. I don't touch AI. and the modeling side of the world is kind of outside of my limits. I know how to like import stuff and make animations, but like those are 3 big systems that I don't even touch. Why sometimes is it like player and other times it's player? I'm not sure I understand what you mean, Solomon. Spaces. Oh, like here? Or in the parameters? Like here? Yeah, white space is a contentious subject. The compiler ignores white space. Like the computer, it sees empty space is empty. It's like whatever. But it's all about how you, the developer, like Steve said, just feels comfortable scripting. There's no difference between player base here and having these all like squished up together. I personally think that looks a little crowded, so I like having single spaces between items. Usually parentheses will stay clamped. Normally, like if I was programming in VS Code, like with C#, we have what we call a linter or a style guide, and it would just enforce those by general. But everyone has a different coding style. That's honestly how you can tell who wrote some code. Like I've been deving in the modding space long enough to know what some people's fingerprints are. Like I can kind of tell when it's Dolphin Scripts or Wardog or Tyson versus someone like AJ or JD or Hunter. So yeah, it's kind of like a fingerprint. Yeah, actually, so Solomon, that's a good call out. So like white space, it matters sometimes. So like, see how I've shorthanded my if statement here, where I don't have any brackets. Technically, I only do this in very specific cases because you can see up here I don't. And in reality, in my opinion, I am of the verbose mindset where you should always surround your things with proper scope, so that people can know. Because ideally, if I did this and saved it and shipped it, no one would get upset. The code would still work. However, if I were to do something like this, add a bunch of spaces in between that wouldn't work. And so, in my opinion, the one reason why I always will fall back on using like I always say brackets and being declarative is the most correct approach, is because it leads to fewer unintended side effects like what I just showed. And in the end, we're trying to write the least buggy code in the shortest amount of time to meet timelines and budget constraints. Steve over here, he has to write code fairly fast, effectively, and bug-free in order to keep his job and stuff. So it's hard. It's a hard thing to do. So the fewer things you have to worry about when you're solving problems, the better it is. How can you tell if someone's used AI? Normally, I can tell if somebody's used AI by the question they are asking and the sterileness of their code. So what I mean by that is people will ask a question like, hey, I'm trying to make an action and I don't know why it's not connected up. I have this code and they'll post code that looks like mine, like freaking verbose and commented, and like if you were to read it, you would understand it type thing. And in my opinion, like if you're asking a very basic question, but your code looks like mine, to me, that means you've copy and pasted. Extensive comments in the code is often a giveaway. Yeah, because ideally, I don't comment my code because as soon as you write a comment, it's deprecated. I would rather have my code comment itself, meaning when you read the code, it's understandable. And so what I mean by that is like, let's look at on action info update, forward declaring a variable, casting it, has selectable books, and then a format. Ideally, I should turn this into a function where it's like format book for format book title. That would make it very obvious to what the code is doing. But then you have code like this, where in my opinion, it's not as intuitive what's going on. And so I will 100% comment it by like, okay, well, if the folder exists, and if I'm expecting people to read it, like I half expected people to open my facepaint mod and look at like what's going on. And so I want them to see what, in my opinion, a good configuration looks like and what they should be emulating. I personally don't use AI for DayZ, mainly because DayZ or Bohemia has not uploaded its code base to ChatGPT or any LLMs, and so there are no good sources of information for any AI to give me good answers. It can give you okay answers, so like recipes, XMLs, you can get pretty far with that if you know what you're doing, but I would never tell a new person to just generate something off of ChatGPT. Yeah, I mean, a curious person can, like, if you know how to code already, coding DayZ is probably a hop, skip, and a jump. Oh, let's take a quick minute to talk about sim linking. Well, I think one of the very contentious topics in DayZ modding community for the past little bit has been the need for a P drive. And actually, you know what? It's been 2 hours, 2.5 hours. I'm gonna take a real quick break. I'll be back in like 3 minutes. Okay, I'm back. All right. So the dreaded P drive conversation, right? Like we've all been here. We all are kind of forced to use the P drive if we use Macaros. And really, anytime anyone brings up any question about packing mods or doing anything like that, people are always saying you need to have a P drive. And the real question I don't ever see answered is why. And the TLDR. Oh, excuse me. The TLDR is like you technically don't need one. However, it makes it very easy for you to have everything in a singular place to verify if stuff is actually working. And I think, at least for scripters, we always are trying to understand if what we're doing is correct fast. And what I mean by that is I don't want to build a whole mod and then run it after 30 or 40 hours worth of work just to see it break for some silly reason, like a file path is missing or something I wasn't expecting, an assumption I had isn't validated. And so the P drive keeps everything in a single spot. And Macaros does a pretty good job of validating that. I would say that it's not required. And it's not required mainly because you can pack with add-on builder without it. So I use it mainly because it helps me create a standardized environment. And why that is important is because when I'm talking to you all or other people across the internet and I have to solve your problems or you want me to solve one of your problems, I want to try and replicate your environment or your sandbox or whatever you've done on your PC on my PC as well. It's really the only way to troubleshoot. And so if you think about that, just that concept for a second, how do I ensure that my stuff is same as your stuff? The only way we can really do that is with a P drive or a similar drive. And so it's one reason why I embrace it. And you'll see here that I have a lot of other mods unpacked in here because, again, I'm modding a lot and public workshop mods can be parsable and sniffable and like unpackable, and you should feel empowered to pull things off the workshop, look into them and understand what they're doing and to learn. Honestly, that's how I did it. And that's how I've grown over the past 4 years, is finding the mods that I liked and understanding how they do them, understanding how they're different from vanilla, if they can be optimized. Because I think an important ethos of modding is that if we're going to be copying something, copying should be done for learning only. Like, I don't see a reason to like build a mod that is the same as someone else's mod and then release it on the workshop. That to me is kind of silly and trivial and more egocentric than anything. But if I'm unpacking a mod and duplicating it just so that I can learn, and then I release something new or better or more optimized or different, I think that's where the spirit of modding needs to be. So feel empowered to pull mods off the workshop and unpack them, just like I did with Dear Isle earlier today. So I downloaded it. Oh my gosh, I gotta load it first. Hold on. Load mod. There we go. Dear Isle. So here's Dear Isle. I know that there was a question about doors, or I mentioned something about the Dear Isle door. Let's look for security system. So we're just unpacking it. I'm gonna put it into our P drive so I can search it with my VS Code. DayZ, Dear Isle security system, scripts, and now I can see everything inside of that mod. Oh, security door. Okay, let's see how he look at that. This is the door. It's a house. He has a net sync for the door change state. If I wanted to mod how the doors are opened, or if I want to mod how the sirens are, if I wanted to turn the sirens off, I now know how to do that. All I need to do is make my own mod, require add-ons, CFG patches, URL security system, mod class JMC security door. Actually, let's do that right here. Instead of just talking about it, let's just do it. Right. Well, I would do something like this. Oh, don't worry, Steve. That's why I was getting close to sim linking, and because Workbench is definitely a part of this. Workbench is so invaluable now that I've started using it. Like, holy cow. File patching and debugging. Oh, if I had debugging 2 years ago, I would have had so many mods out in the workshop. 9 times out of 10, I debug by packing my stuff, loading a server, connecting to it. And that's a 30-second to a minute and a half life cycle or a feedback loop. Oof, it's tough. Okay, so I want to override JMC's door. So I know that's the class I need to mod. I know that I want to turn off the sirens. So then I would say override that. And if I wanted to not call super, right, so if I were to do something like this, if I were to say super.start sirens, this would do, it would do whatever's in here. It would just call this code. It would set the door staging, changing state to true. It would set sync dirty. It would set some time, and then the call queue would be called. And then I could be like, maybe I want to, you know, spawn a bunch of zombies or something. Cool. What if I wanted to stop this stuff from happening? Well, I would just not call super. Boom, done. And then I can just do my stuff. What if I wanted to do some things in here, but not all? Well, at that point, you're out of luck. You got to copy everything. You'll need to paste it. And then you'll need to change the parts that you don't want. And then go from there. This third option is destructive and an incredibly dangerous breaking change, especially if you're making a mod for the workshop. If this is for like a private server, like whatever, you know that your mod is the last mod in the call stack and you don't have to worry about it. But if you're going to be like putting something on the workshop, don't ever not call super and do this. Like, you need to maintain the call chain. So that's how you would do this. Okay. So P drive. I mentioned earlier about the P drive and why it's important. The P drive is arbitrary. Call it whatever the heck you want. The easiest way, in my opinion, to interface with the P drive is to symlink your files. And symlink, symbolic linking, is very old technology from way back in the day. But you might have asked yourselves the question, why do some of my folders have an arrow going to it and why do others not? And you're kind of seeing my growth as a modder over time, where I started putting everything into individual folders, then I eventually kind of put things into a single folder, and then I eventually just moved everything out of my P drive in general. And this is because I personally try to subscribe to like a zero state or a stateless work environment. Ideally, I should be able to delete my files, all my folders in my workspace, and regenerate it without fear of losing anything. And I think that's a powerful state to be in, and not one that is very much fostered within the community. And so I personally keep all of my files, at least lately, in a totally separate drive inside of a folder I call modding. And that's version controlled by Git. And so essentially what I've done is I could go to my P drive, open a new window. I couldn't find it. I can go to my P drive and I can delete these. Oh my gosh, no! And some of you would be terrified at this point. Oh my God, I just deleted years worth of work. However, with symlinking, you don't have to worry about that ever again, because you can keep your files anywhere on your drive. And then you can link them back to where you need to go. And so I have scripts to do this because I don't like doing it more than once. And you can see very plainly, if we look at our template, right, to do a symlink on Windows, doesn't really matter where you're at, you type mk link make link /j for junction. You don't really need to care about what that j means, just use it. If you do care, Google it. And then there is the destination. So where will this file live? So in our case, it's going to live in P drive / whatever the mod name is. Okay. And then the source is going to be my z / DayZ / modding / whatever the mod name is. All right, and the way I've sort of set it up, I have an add-ons folder, and so I personally would also include add-ons. And so let's go ahead and run this script. So I don't have those folders in here anymore, my P drive, right? But I do have my source still here in my Z drive. Version control, technically you could have it on a external whatever, right? And I'm gonna link to P. Boom. And here they are. And now, again, the whole reason to have a P drive is so that I can open DayZ projects with some file editor and search everything at once. Right? If any of you have ever used Unreal or other engines, the power of having everything in one spot is invaluable, so you're not context switching between views. Literally, you save hours and hours and hours over a long period of time by just having it here and clicking in the left-hand menu instead of having a gajillion of these open and like clicking through windows down to the bottom and trying to understand where they're at. And so the sim linking is very powerful. It's the beginning of the Workbench usage. Because now, since we have the concept of a symlink in our head and we know how to make one, we can eventually symlink the same source files to our DayZ installation folder. And this is important because the DayZ diag executable requires source files, not PBOs. And it's great because we don't have to duplicate data. Every time all these guys are saying you got to copy this stuff from here to there. Oh my gosh, again, think of how much time you can save by just making the change in one spot, and it's both in your P drive and your DayZ diag folder. It's just no more copying, no more having to remember, did I check it? Did I actually copy it? Did I delete the old one? Did I copy the key right? Like, oh my gosh, I got so tired of that. So that, in my opinion, in a nutshell, is why the P drive is important and how to utilize it effectively so that you don't have to keep everything in DayZ projects, because who knows what updates will happen with DayZ Extract or DayZ Tools or Macaros. Don't let other tools, be have your source files at mercy. So I think that's a good part to stop, unless there are any questions out in the audience. We've been going at this for 3 hours now. I'll definitely do another one of these for the Workbench, because again, file patching is really useful. Kind of weird question. My array I, if I have an array and index is out of bounds, depending on type, will it return empty string or 0? By its default, stuff like that, is there a way to return null instead? Because if I don't know what the index is not valid, I have no way to know if value is real. You're looking for, perfect example is valid index. Arrays have is valid index, which will return -1. So just check. That's what I do for an array. Array.isValidIndex, and then I'll index into it. Why is my... Oh my gosh. My pen is very fat because I use one of those multi-color pens that have, what's that? Yeah, so one of these. Okay, well, I guess while we're winding down, for some of the people that are not as familiar with scripting, we'll just review some of the basics here. I probably should have done this at the beginning, but I half expect people to already have looked at this and like made a P drive and extracted the DayZ files. Like that's kind of all level 0 stuff that other guys handle. But let's see, basics, code block, right? We're dealing with scope, declaration and definition, functions, programming structure, right? Every class has a class. Oh, yeah, I had it on dark mode at one point, but sorry. Here. That's funny. My bad. I really do need to get to the dark mode. Anyway, everything starts with class. Usually, you'll never not have a class. Oh man. Okay, hold on. Here's another thing that's kind of important. That's kind of on the basics of scripting. It kind of touches on scripting and configs. So when you think about config data, DayZ, gear, camping, data, or the config, right? So you know how like in these configs, you'll see this thing right here, like class inventory base, class container base, class world container base, and they're only done once. You'd be like, why don't they do them elsewhere? Why are they only done once? This is actually a relic of old programming. Okay. And basically, if you were to think of a program from the computer's perspective, you give the computer a program, a single program. You don't give them a bunch of files and say, oh, here you go. No, you take files, you take everything and you compile it. I use the word deliberately here, compile it, or transpile in the case of configs. I imagine they're not actually compiling it. Although it is a CPP, maybe these are headers. I don't know. I don't know the mechanics of how this language works. But anyway, what I can expect is that all of these config CPPs will be turned into a single file. And the reason why we put these forward declares in front is because when the code is actually being turned into a single file, the compiler will take this and actually copy and paste the entire definition into here. Okay, so these are probably linked. Never mind. Anyway, so when the computer sees this, it's not going to see class inventory base semicolon. It's actually going to see class inventory base blah, 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 like a bunch of other stuff in here. And the reason why is because, again, when we're at runtime, we don't actually have like access to everything else. We are confined to our stack and our heap at runtime. And so this is a kind of an entrance into that. Same with scripts. Your scripts as well are all loaded into a singular file and run at runtime. And so like at that point, where are we going? Oh. Just like get an item, some random item. Okay. So the reason why this matters is because like when I mod this class, I'm essentially adding on to the end of what's already here. And so like a big portion of the language that the devs have wrote is like being able to take my modded keywords and stuff and my overridden keywords and concatenating them onto the existing call stack. And I'm assuming they're doing it through some clever form of inheritance and child classing. But that's one of the things that's kind of outside of our purview as modders. We don't really get to know that stuff. Do we get a certification after this class is ended so I can apply at a game dev company? I mean, maybe. What I find interesting and really cool is that in my time here in the DayZ modding community, I have seen firsthand more than 5 modders be hired on, and I imagine more would have been able to be hired on if they are willing to move to the Czech Republic. I mean, the Bohemian Interactive Studios is based in Prague, I believe. So, like, you might be joking, but like, in my opinion, this is a perfect pipeline for devs on their side because A, we're familiar with their interface, and B, we understand the standard, the vision, the mission, and less training overhead. So like, yeah, I could totally see them crawling the modders Discord. Plus, you want people that work for your business that like the product, you know, and modders have generally indicated that they're willing to spend their free time as hobbyists to mod a game, and that shows genuine interest, which is you know, spending your free time on anything is a mindful activity because it's the only real resource you have that is non-refundable. Oh yeah, let's go back to that. Sorry. Variables, we did functions, comments, constants. Constants are a big one. You can mod these. You just can only have one of them. Arithmetic operators. Modulo is nice. Modulo will return the remainder of a division operation, since integer operations are whole numbers. 1 divided by 2 is 0. 1 mod 2 is 1. Right? Because there's no, when you divide a number, there's 1 divided by 2, there's no actual value there, but with modulo, there's 1 remaining. Assignments, bitwise operations, that's probably for another. Left and right shifts, that's for another one. Bitwise operations are really fun. They're very powerful. So if you have, you know, less than 32 options or something, which is a very specific use case. This index operator. Oh, that's cool. Okay, yeah, private, protected, static. Private means we can only call that class from inside the same class. This is part of encapsulation, not letting your code be touched by other people or other collaborators, or allowing it to be touched by outside classes or collaborators. Granted, these are suggestions. There's always ways around them. I mean, there's really no way to restrict code from being called at runtime. Protected is only allowed to be called from inside the class or extended classes. A little bit more. I personally use protected a lot, just to show that you shouldn't be calling my stuff outside of these classes. Again, to enforce some encapsulation and some design hierarchy. Static is very special. Static means it can only be referenced. It can be referenced anywhere without a pointer, but only static members can access static members. And this is a kicker here, because you can get yourself into trouble. Static is one of those things where if you don't really know how it works or why you're able to call it outside of members, you shouldn't be using it unless you're modding like missed gameplay functions or something like that. 9 times out of 10, you don't need static. I've rarely found uses of static unless you're building large, managing, overarching classes, or you're being very quick and curt and want to solve a problem without doing a total fix. It's like a band-aid. It's like duct tape. Override, you've all used that. It's how you signal to the compiler you're changing functionality. Prototype, this is C++ functions. We have no access to that. Same with native. We don't get any access to those. These are things that devs add for us, which are fun. Method functions and methods, variables have the same thing. Private, protected, static are the same. Auto pointer, I shudder whenever I see people use auto pointer. Please don't use auto pointer. You don't really need to know. You don't need to use it. Just Usually if auto pointer is present, I assume it's been ChatGPT generated. ChatGPT loves auto pointer. We don't have access to proto. We talked about refs earlier. Constant cannot be modified. These are important. It can be redefined though. If you're just like setting its value, but you can't like modify it. You can only set it at declare time, not runtime. Out is a special keyword. Somebody in chat earlier had a question like, how do I send out two variables or whatever? Or how do I return two things from a single function? You could use out to return more than one thing from a property, from a parameter, or in a method signature. I generally don't recommend using in-outs or outs just because if you're trying to return multiple things, just make an object that holds those things. And I generally don't like messing with properties in a function. Like, I feel like that's poor reference managing. You should just have a function that returns the thing. But in game design, you're doing a lot of clever like pointer passing around, and so it makes sense that you just pass a pointer around. Like, I get it. It just isn't as clean. It's harder for a newer person to understand what's going on, but definitely more advanced. Modded is on class. It's how you signal to the compiler a class is modded and changing. Oh gosh. New memory, new object, deletes an object. You really shouldn't be deleting objects unless you know what you're doing. Class extends, type def. You probably aren't ever going to use type defs. Turn null this super thread. I hear a lot of people talk about threads. In my opinion, they should just be removed from the from the syntax. Don't use DayZ threads. You probably don't have a good use case for them. Or you probably haven't already read all the stuff in DayZ scripting. Okay, this is actually important. Primitive types. Oh, nice. Okay, cool. So string is a primitive. Oh, vectors are primitive too? I didn't realize that. Okay, so in each language, primitives, there are different primitives in different languages, mainly just because primitives or data has to be represented in memory. If you remember my awesome image from back here, right? You have memory, which is these lines. I like to conceptualize it as a list of registers or a list of cubby holes, each containing 64 cubbies that can hold a 1 or 2 value. Again, you either have 16 or 32 gigabytes of these things. An application will reserve a certain amount of memory at any given time, and then there will be any given of actively used RAM. And so if you think about a single register and it's 64, in some cases, if you have a 32-bit operating system, you only have 32 of these boxes. So if you were to think of these registers in the 64 boxes, ones and zeros, there is a theoretical maximum limit or values of data that you can actually store in those registers. And so for integers, we have a nice 2 billion value. If it's signed, meaning it has a plus or negative value, it's 2 billion. If it's unsigned, we can remove all the negative values and add them to this, which leads it to like 4.2 billion. Floats. Floats are interesting because they're precise but inaccurate, if that makes sense. And what I mean by that is to store a very small number, or to understand that a number is 0.00000, like 20 zeros and a 1, you have to be very precise. But the accuracy of the math that you do with those values is imprecise or inaccurate. And so there's always this notion of precision when you're dealing with numbers that are not whole. And that's a whole nother discussion and argument if you really care about it. Google Mantissa, or how do computers represent floating numbers or decimals. Like, that's just a huge thing. And they do it differently between Windows and Linux. Looks like Booleans are true, false. It's either 1 or 0. Strings, just characters. Vector looks like a very well-defined value. And the void, class, and type name. So these are primitives. They don't need references. And we talked about references earlier. And the reason why is because these values can be stored directly on memory. Right? I can actually flip this bit onto 1, 0, 1, 1, 1, and that actually equal a number. Or I can store, a series of characters in that value as well. Whereas if it's like an object, like an entity AI or an item base that has 30 or 40 integers inside of it, you would need a much larger register or space. And so the shape of your object on memory would be different. And we would call that a complex, or forget the name, but it's not a primitive type. So here's some examples of those things. Enums. Enums are just ints, named ints, nothing more than that. A quirk in DayZ I found is that you cannot override enums in 3-game, but you can override enums in 4-world, which I found pretty interesting. But really, it's just a way to put a name to a number and then use that name in code. It can be very useful for getting rid of magic numbers and being a little more declarative of intent. Templates. Oh my gosh, templates are great. If you're an advanced dev and you know about generics, this is kind of close to that. And you can build generic data based on payloads passed in. So if you're familiar with T-string array, that's kind of a template that you just use by default. The ideal way is to extend enums and not mod them. I think that's what I meant. So let me see if I can get an example of what I was trying to do. Maybe you can tell me if I was right or wrong. Okay. Enums are great. I abuse the heck out of them. Right. So I can do something like this in 4-world, but I can't do it in 3-game. And I have a suspicion it's because in 3-game, they're not fully instantiated at that time. Like I can't mod something, I can't extend something that doesn't exist. But I can't do this in 3-game. This syntax. And it's also, you can't do that either. You have to use the semicolon. So this little quirk of the engine, I've learned from experience, but not that big of a deal, honestly. Like it's really more notifiers. I tried to do this in 3-game, right? But I can't. But no big deal. Arrays, static arrays. Most people don't use static arrays because we like the nice dynamicness of string arrays, which are really just a type def of array string. I mean, and scroll structures. Okay, so this is the Booleans. So I know, what's his face? He was in here earlier, scrolling up. Is it Solomon? Yeah, it was Solomon asking about Boolean logic. This right here, I mean, in my opinion, kind of highlights the... I mean, these are the basics, and you can chain these together as much as you want. Switch statements. I personally don't like switches. Somebody asked a question, what's the difference between an if statement and a switch statement? And the answer to that is, if you're not much, unless you have more than 10 if statements. Ideally, you use switches for things that have like a ton of items, because the compiler will either optimize it one way or the other. For loops, iterators are important, being able to iterate over an array. You start with the for keyword, you then declare your index. We usually start our indexes at 0. There are other alternative strategies that start them at the end of the array. And we then say our condition, as long as our index is less than 3, as long as our index is less than the 3 items in the group or in the array, keep adding to our index. Also, alternatively, start at the end. As long as our index is greater than 0 or greater than -1, keep decrementing our index. One of the two. For each is syntactic sugar, as I like to call it. This will take an array and it will give you a variable instead of having you declare the variable. But if you still need access to the index, you can declare the for each this way. Very useful. I've started using this syntax a lot just because I like having the object here and instead of having to cast it. So this for each is really useful. While loops, I tend not to use while loops because you can get in trouble with long running functions, which can cause performance issues. I personally have not found a use case for while loop yet that cannot be solved with better use of events. Like 9 times out of 10, if you show me you have a while loop, I would be saying, when are you calling your code and when do you need this code to like happen? Because like only the devs need to use while. Like while the game needs to run the update loop, you know, like that's important. It's weird hearing you condense down your 2 years of teaching. I know, right? Yeah, for those who don't know, Admiral is somebody that, we started deving together. I didn't know the modeling side, but I know the scripting side because I'm a programmer in my professional career. And so when we were developing for Survivalists back when we were just learning how to mod, he taught me how to model, import things into Blender and do that thing, and I taught him how to script. And as you can see now, he makes some pretty freaking sweet mods. I get jealous every now and then. Let's see, constructor, destructor. Oh, this is an important one, constructor and destructor. So one of the pet peeves of a lot of programmers is people will say deconstructor. Don't ever say that. Nothing's being deconstructed. We are destroying it. All right. If you say deconstructor, that's something that'll lower your salary by like $1,000 if you're a dev. It's destructor, constructor, destructor. Constructor constructs the object. It initializes the memory. It does some special stuff for referencing. It does anything inside of the constructor, and then it makes the object available for, in the heap. The destructor does the opposite of that. It will deallocate memory, it'll dereference, and it will destroy the memory. Like the destructor, after the destructor is run, the object does not exist ever, anywhere. So like you can get into trouble by doing things here and expecting to do like state cleanup outside of the destructor. No, can't do that. After you get out of the scope, that thing is gone. Calling destructor, oh my gosh, you guys are killing me. But yeah, the destructor is important, and you will see most of the time in DayZ the destructor being used to clean up sounds, particles, things that really need to like get rid of this stuff like as the thing is being cleaned up. Really useful for cleanup. Managed, everything in DayZ is basically managed. I mean, for the purposes of this discussion, you don't really need to know about managed. Like most of the things you deal with are managed. You yourself, the scripter, won't need to really ever make a managed class. 9 times out of 10. The only time I've ever really seen managed used is in like community framework or expansion, people that actually know what they're doing. So don't use managed unless you know what you're doing. Oh, cool. They have some automatic reference counting. So if my explanation earlier about references was too confusing, here is a more succinct value or description of it. Right, we got a hint of the compiler, it's a strong reference. Something needs to keep track of the reference. You don't explicitly tell the compiler that a reference exists. It will get rid of it as the scope is written. Usage of ref. Oh my gosh. 9 times out of 10, you don't need to use ref. Don't use it. No cyclical references. Oh, optimal usage of reference in Enforce script is to have exactly one strong reference per object placed in owner. This way ensures no cyclical reference. Okay, so we could technically have cyclical references. Do we have, what do they call them? Ring lists? A ring list? where it's a ring where basically it's just revolving and it'll delete data if it reads over it. I'm not sure if we have it. Here's a good example of refs. Modding, right? Here's how you mod classes. We already talked about that. Modded constants. You can mod constants because you can always mod something at defined time. Modded private members, right? You can mod private members. Nothing stops you from that. And look at that, we're at the bottom. I thought it was interesting, just in closing remarks, because we're getting to the end. When we talk about modding DayZ, like what do you actually need? This is basically it. And really, CFG mods is only needed if you're adding scripts. So a good example of that is I've been testing out the limits of that. And if you notice, most of my mods that I've been releasing lately only have that. And you know, the documentation is correct. It's kind of funny. You see all this other crud put in here, and I think that's just relics of Arma. I'm not sure, but I don't see any evidence or an indication of evidence that it needs to be present. And so this is kind of what I've been going by. And then I think next time we will work on getting Workbench to spawn or start spawn. Oh, it really is as easy as this. So yeah. Thanks everyone for hanging out. I really appreciate it. It made the 3 hours kind of blow by. Any questions as we're wrapping up? We'll be doing this again next week, so we'll focus on more advanced topics. We'll do the workbench, and we'll get Diag up and running so that we can see file patching working. Where will I publish the video to watch it again? I will take this video and I'll upload the raw content on YouTube immediately, but then I'm also going to get Aliveric to cut it up for me and reduce it. I think I faffed around a few minutes, and last thing I want is people trying to watch a 3-hour video. I'll probably cut it down into specific topics. What's my YouTube? Oh, good question. And I have my DayZ stuff already. I have a DayZ playlist for stuff like that because I share it with my wife. So I know the basics, but what's the difference between open close bracket and open close bracket with a semicolon at the end? This is a good, yeah, okay. So nothing really, other than the fact that a semicolon in DayZ is considered a statement. And if you want to really care about the history, you can probably search the Discord about a lot of the arguments as to why and why people think it's a silly thing. But personally, I think of it as a period at the end of a sentence. Whereas if I don't, while it's not required, I feel like my class is incomplete or not fully, T's crossed and I's dotted until there's an end thing here. And this is a legacy of my JavaScript programming, mainly because of the interpretive nature of it and how you could technically have something like, I don't know the exact specifics, but some people mention that things can happen outside of unintended consequences can happen if you don't terminate your class. There's no real side effect that I've noticed. People smarter than me say it. I subscribe to the B. I subscribe to this version. I like terminating my lines, my classes with a semicolon, just because it feels good. What's the difference between foo extends bar and foo :bar. Nothing. The second one is syntactic sugar, shorthand of Gooder modding. The first one is extends. Yeah, shorter. I personally like using extends. So in my code, you will always see me use extends because a new person modding that's learning from my scripts understands this more intuitively than that. Mainly because they see foo extends bar. Okay, I understand inheritance. Whereas if they've never programmed before and they've never seen C# inheritance, they'll be like, "What's this?" And they'll ask your question in DayZ chat. Which, in my opinion, anything that disrupts my current like chain of thought is disruptive to my learning process. It's an event that can maybe like distract me to doing something else. And so I'm all about like, how do I gamify my brain so I'm focusing on like this thing and only this thing? Because I know myself, I will get distracted and go off. Yeah, the fact that Admiral's able to have his compiler open and like code while we play Elden Ring is like, what? How can you do that? For the video, this is the certificate that you get. You're a modder pleb for being so smart and listening to me going for 4 hours. Makes your brain bigger, and here's the proof. Teacher tree. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's any of the questions. I'll give it another minute or so. No questions too silly. Oh, dude, Sajid added. This is my favorite part of the freaking Discord. Seeing like this stuff here, like Henry, you putting out the weapon safety. Like, it's kind of crazy to think that DayZ's been out for 7-8 years, right? Like, I've only been modding for 4. Something as simple as this just releasing. Like, this AI stuff is killer. I never thought we would get something like this in DayZ. Like, I love it. So cool. Wait for armor hitboxes next week. Yeah, I'm waiting. I've been waiting for you to drop your mod so that I can add it to our server, because that realistic hitboxes will be really cool, especially for the PvP server. Shill our stuff, time to sell out. Oh, yeah, I guess I can shill a little bit. I'll cut this out of the video. Face Paint's the best mod out there. Universal Repair. This was one that I was surprised was not in vanilla DayZ. And actually, oh, I need to put in a bug report. Because well, actually, it's not really a bug report. So on our server, we changed the things so that things can be stackable, but the plugin repair doesn't consider quantity of a kit of a repair kit for the repair costs. And so you could technically, so when you set the kits to be is splittable or can be combined, what our players were doing were splitting them down to 1% and then using them to heal a full level. Like, my goodness, kids these days. Show us how to use feedback tracker. Oh gosh, I'm about to out myself. Somebody who doesn't use feedback tracker. Okay, hold on. Feedback. Okay, at least I have the URL. I have an account at least. All right, so how do you use feedback tracker? So we need to navigate to feedback.bi studio. And we need to, I think it's either DayZ or DayZ modding. Oh, DayZ. To submit a report, click on the star in the top right corner of the page and select New DayZ PC Bug Report. Bing. And not read anything else and telling you how to actually put it in. When reporting sensitive information, such as dupes, please use private form exclusively. The TLDR, just joking, I was gonna say use the private form always, but make sure you label, use good information, make sure you're very descriptive. I hate it when people put in bug reports, the game crashed. Oh my gosh. Right, steps to reproduce, getting your DXDAG file. Oh, okay, this one actually, you go to Windows, so you can either press your Windows key, right, or you can click the Windows button, type run, literally just type run, don't even try to search for it, right? DX, so you can even see I do it all the time, because when people be like, what specs do you have on your computer? And this is an easy way for me to just never have to remember and just be like, oh yeah, well, here's my specs. Boom, done. And then getting your crash dumps. So this is telling you exactly where your client script files will be. I showed this earlier, but I'm just going to copy and paste this, what they have here, right? This % local app data % is a Windows keyword. You can just paste it into your bar, and it'll take you directly to where you need to go. And then you just search for DayZ. DayZ. Boom. Right here. And like they say, the crash log would be like right here. Sort by latest, right? So you get your best. Don't send them a bad crash report or an old one. And there you go. Pretty easy. I have a couple tickets opens, but this guy named G's barely does anything. That's a joke. Disclaimer, that was a joke. Pretty sure G's is a pseudonym account or a moniker used for whoever manages the tracker at any given time. Okay. That's it. I'm gonna go and call it. That's been almost 3.5 hours. Jeez. All right, I'm gonna go get some lunch, and I'll see you guys next week. Oh, what am I supposed to shill? That's right, show off Western Z. Oh my good mods. I mean, I guess if I were to say engineers are really bad at like showcasing. I'm an engineer, man. The knowledge itself is, in my opinion, the cool part of this. I guess if I were to pick something that I'm really proud of right now, it would be my map. I think DayZ map making is probably one of the hardest things to do, because it converges all of the aspects of the game into a singular discipline. So you need to know like model making so you can build nice models for the map. You need to know scripting to actually understand how like everything is working in the background. You need to know all these other tools that aren't part of DayZ itself. Okay, so let's see. My P drive mounted. One of the things I like to do is basically everything that I have is run by scripts. So, CDZ. Let's do Tombstone Diag. Okay, and so next time when we do this, I'm launching through the Diag version of the game, which is in the DayZ folder, not DayZ server folder. And the Diag client just lets you do more, inspect the game. I mean, in my opinion, it's probably what the devs test their stuff on before they do production builds, because they're using Workbench, most likely. Western Zoo is related to Survivalists. Or it's related in the sense that it's made by the devs. And this is more the reason why I've been moving to push my mods more open source, more to the workshop. So I spent about 2.5 years deving for Survivalist Learning, and I learned a lot of ways how to not do things. And we recently did a big push to change change maps and stuff, and we wiped. And I've been rebuilding all my mods from scratch again, which has just been awesome because I get to dump old tech debt, which is not something you get to do. But yeah, here's the map that we've been working on. I got enough of the sat map to work. I've generated all of the plant life through sFlora, so I haven't placed a single one of these by hand. Let's see. The Diag mode is awesome because you can do things like this. Was render, and then I want to do something like show me the geometry. Let's do geometry. Okay, right, and you want to see like how taxing is this environment on my PC? Well, I mean, you can see exactly here how many verts your computer's having to render in most cases for all the outside stuff. Why is the ground purple? I think this is a mix between one of the surfaces and the sat map. Another thing that I think I'm pretty proud of is the one of everything make. So when I started doing map making, I realized there's not very much information around starting from scratch. And there's no way to know if your environment is like standardized. And so I created a one of everything maker, which parses the P drive, pulls out all the P3Ds, puts them in a list, and then puts it into a mod. Since I have this up, I'll go and turn that on. I go to DayZ, right? Then I go to my profile, and then I go to my folder where I keep everything. So I have this configuration file which says I'm spawn one of everything. Starting point's there. It's enabled. So all I need to do is dump these in. So this is every single P3D in the game that DayZ exposes through their files, and then some of my other P drive things. Why did it not show up? Probably I'm not loading the mod that has it. Oh, yeah, I'm not loading the mods. Is that what it is? Cool. Let that regenerate. Love required add-ons. Oh, no, Noel, do I use QGIS? No, I didn't. Oh, wait, yes, I did. Sorry. I used QGIS to pull the satellite map and I used OTB, Orfeo Toolbox, to generate a satellite or surface mask. And then I used Sflora to generate the trees from the surface mask. And so I'll open up those here in a second. Tombstone, source, QGIS, export. So this will load the sat map. Right, this was created by QGIS. And then this is the surface mask generated by QGIS by OSM, the default. All right, you can see it's very rudimentary. However, I used Orfeo Toolbox to pick specific colors in the satellite map to eventually map something that looks more like this. Now, this is what dictates what the ground looks like in game. Like when I look at the ground and I see that texture there, it's because the color, right here is whatever it is. And I know that this orange is gravel. So if I were to go to my if I were to go over here, you would notice that the ground is gravel, or the water's gravel. Oh no! The God moded. What's the tool I'm using for the mask? I'm using something called Sflora. And Sflora is a third-party program. Party people. Let's see, DayZ, assets, Sflora. Open my map. Like you can see that I've imported my sat map here. I have a bunch of inside of each one of the color definitions, I have the trees that I want. Trees that I want generated in there. I've defined their minimum and maximum distances. And then eventually I click, generate. And if I were to, let's say, go into something like this. And there you go. I can use this to eyeball the placement and the distribution of things before I generate it for the whole map. Basically. And so when we talk about earlier, I mentioned it's all about rapid prototyping and getting feedback to what you're doing. I don't want to spend a week placing trees just to see that the trees that I placed suck, right? So I do this, generate them. Does it look good? If the answer is no, then I'll regenerate again. And then once I get something I like that looks decent, I'll put it into the game. And that's a way to keep that feedback loop tight, so I'm not wasting my time or just lollygagging. Really, it's just more of a mindful approach. What was the road tool you mentioned? Road tool mentioned is just the normal road tool inside of inside of Terrain Builder. Sorry. Alrighty, it worked. Okay, cool. Jade, a quick call. Yeah, I don't know any of the hotkeys, but I mentioned earlier what I was kind of proud of. The one of everything, in my opinion, is revolutionary, and you can't really see it that well because it's on the ground. I've clamped everything on the ground, but as I fly over here, you'll see that there are just a ton of objects on the ground, just a ton of objects. And this is because in traditional mapping, we've been using the one of everything from like an Arma build or some DayZ build like forever ago. So like what I've done here is I've just done it so that you can pull everything out of the P drive. And so anytime DayZ updates now, we don't have to worry about getting an out-of-date file because you can just auto-generate it. And so it's kind of crazy how much stuff is out there. Like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of items. It's hundreds. Let me show you these when they're in the air. Yeah, S-Flora is not used because it requires a very specific setup of QGIS, OTB, and something else. I wrote a guide about it. And you can find that guide here along with all of my other guides because I don't like writing things or having to answer questions twice. A lot of times I'll write down the information. So like, I know we're, gosh, so far out. Pennyworth did a really good write-up on map frame values and stretching. This is a very common question asked in DayZ terrain builders all the time. Why are my maps stretching? Or why do I have poor tiling? He doesn't go over the poor tiling, but why is my map stretching? Well, that's because you have a bad overlap. The TLDR with that is you are always going to have some amount of stretch unless you pick absolutely perfect properties, in which case your overlap is going to be, your stretch is going to be like 16 pixels, which in reality is going to be 32 because you have to think about both sides of your image. So that's a pretty big gotcha for most map makers. And if you don't get your tile grid right, your land grid right, you're going to have improper tiles, and you will start placing things and realize, oh my gosh, I have like a whole kilometer of just duplicated tiles. It only does it in your borders. That's why I made an island. Well, that's because if you read further down, the way the game, or really terrain builder, cuts it up is if you think of a square, right? A square has 4 sides. And so if you have more tiles, in which case a tile is one of these boxes, if you have more tiles than can fit evenly in a box, so divisible by 4, so if I can't divide my tiles in grid by 4 and that equals 0, I will always, mind you, always have misaligned tiles at the end. Period. And the reason why is because it's not evenly divided, right? We're in a square. If we don't have, right, if this was 16 squares, if I had 19 squares, I'd have to add a new line and go 17, 18, 19, and then I'd have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 tiles that are empty that I would just pick random tiles for and fill it in. So, and most likely it's just going to pick the last one and then fill it in. So that's a really easy one to fix. You just make sure that your tiles in grid is divisible by 4, meaning you can divide it by 4 and then the result is 0. The stretching is a little bit more different, and that's because of this. Because of the way the tiles are overlaid themselves. And this actually took me a long time to understand this image. If you look here, you start with the pink, then you go with the green, then you go with the blue. So if the pink square is my first, right? And then my green square is my second row. You can kind of see how we will always have some form of stretching, because no matter what, we're cutting our map into pieces, into chunks. And if you've ever been underneath, let me go ahead and showcase that real quick. If you've ever been underneath the map, you will see that overlap. I'm going to turn this to float. So that stretching thing just turns into a math problem, a really fun math problem that Pennyworth has already solved for us. All right, now we're cooking. This is the last thing I'm showing, I promise. I'm not going to go over 4 hours. God. I did Hour of Code last week with a bunch of high schoolers and middle schoolers, so it's very much similar to that. Right, better get cleaning. Ah, here we go. Yeah. So just to show like the sheer volume of things in the game, right? This is every single P3D. Well, these ones aren't. But all this grass on the ground. All these trees. These rocks. And what you'll notice is that as I'm flying through here, you haven't seen half of these in any map. Literally any map other than a vanilla DayZ map. Some of these just have never been used before because the old one of everything model or file didn't have it. And so this mod here that I'm showing off is meant to rectify that. Well, what I need to do is I need to write out these positions to file so that you can import them into TB, Terrain Builder, and then you'd be able to just use them normally. So this is the other thing that in my opinion, I'm pretty proud of, mainly because this is for all map makers and things like that. One of those things that, you know, when you're new, it's like, how do I know I'm doing the right thing? Well, and how do I know that I'm up to date? Well, it's always up to date, and it's the right thing because it's the standard. It's funny, if you notice, these churches pop in, and then when you get real close, they go away. Proxy magic right there. And that's DayZ proxy magic. Did you make a cluster with these objects? These objects are being generated from the types library that I generated already. So if you think of right, I have a bunch of Tomo files for my template libraries in Terrain Builder. I've just ripped out the names and put them into a list of P3Ds. So if you mean like a cluster, yeah, these are all the P3Ds in the template libraries that I create. And this can be run once an update to pull the P3Ds out of DayZ P drive, basically. So eventually, I'll set up a automated job using some Steam account that is an automated build account. And anytime official releases, there'll be a job that'll just crawl the P drive, or it'll extract the data, crawl that P drive, pull out the P3Ds, and then upload it so that we all have it. I mean, this is just one step away from the one of everything text file that we all have. So I just need to get that done. But there's only 24 hours in the day. Ooh, look at that. Now that's cool. Put that in front of your door and put a sparking effect on it. Bzz, bzz, bzz. And then a trigger nearby. If you get close, it'll arc to you and kill you. God, the possibilities are endless. Idea stolen. DMCA. If you repack that idea, I'm going to DMCA you. Thanks for that. Let's see. We got the bunkers. Over here are the land tiles for the Namalskor, one of the bunkers. In my opinion, these are really cool because they showcase that you can just take your height map, put it into Blender, bring it back into the game and tile it. So seamless bunkers can be possible. Okay, yeah, that's it. I think we're good. That's enough shilling for one day. I'll be more prepared next time. Oh, shilling is just like advertising without remorse. Like, imagine I'm a representative of like Pepsi or some cola, and I'm like, buy Pepsi because we're the best. You should buy Pepsi. And like, here's how good Pepsi is. Oh man, it's so good. That's kind of shilling. Or like, subscribe, sub now. Smash that like button. All right, cool. Well, thank you all for attending. I appreciate the time that you spent with me, and I will make sure to do another more advanced one of these next time to build on the concepts we've talked about today and focus more on Workbench, file patching, and diag mode and stuff like that. So digest this. I'll upload the video soon, and I'll see you next week. Bye, everyone.